All right, welcome to the joint meeting of the Finance and Corporate Services and Planning and Housing Committees. And as we begin our meeting today, and on behalf of Ottawa City Council, I wish to acknowledge that Ottawa is built on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. The City of Ottawa honors the peoples and land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation and honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. I'll ask the committee coordinator now to do a quick roll call of all members, please.
Councillor Luloff.
Still here.
Councillor Dudas.
Here.
Councillor Curry.
Here.
Councillor Kelly.
Present.
Councillor Kavanaugh.
Present.
Councillor Johnson.
Here.
Councillor Tierney.
Present.
Councillor King.
Here.
Councillor Troster.
Here.
Councillor Brockington. Councillor Menard.
Here.
Councillor Giroux.
Here.
Councillor Lowe.
Here.
Vice Chair Gower.
Here.
Vice Chair Kitts.
Here.
Chair Leeper.
You see?
Mayor Sutcliffe.
Here.
You have a quorum, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Are there any declarations of interest? Confirmation of minutes from November 2nd and 3rd, 2023. Are the minutes confirmed? Item 4.1 is the Affordable Housing Capital Strategy and Update. Is that carried? Item 5.1, we will hold for the moment. Actually, I think everything else we can just move forward with. There's nothing else to approve on consent. So we'll just go ahead with item 5.1, which is the Vacant Unit Tax Program update on year one data and improvements. We have a presentation and a couple of delegations and some motions. So we'll start with the presentation, please.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of the committee. I'm joined today with my colleagues Joseph and Lance, and we're going to provide an update on the VUT program. As we've committed to, we will be back this time with after we went through a full cycle of this program, and that's what we're before you today in terms of reporting on the data and the status of this program. Next slide, please. I'll start off with a little bit of context and background in terms of the VUT program. So again, the purpose of the VUT program is in response to the city's overall housing crisis. The goal of this program is to really ensure that residential properties and housing stock is put back onto the market to help with the actual supply of housing and actually, contribute towards affordable housing as well. By increasing the housing supply, the VUT helps provide housing affordability for residents across the city. And as a reminder, as we go through this presentation today, if you recall back in March through the Ontario-Ottawa New Deal, a component of that deal was the city's commitment to strengthen the VUT program as one of the conditions in that overall $543 million program that we signed back in March, April. Another very important aspect of this program is that all net proceeds from this program goes into the city's housing long-range financial plan. And at the next agenda item after this one right here, we'll provide an update on that long-range financial plan, and again, speak to the contributions that we received from this program into that plan. In 2023, the VUT contributed $10.3 million to the city's affordable housing initiatives. And going forward, that contribution is forecasted to be in the $7.6 to $8 million range on a go-forward basis. And that's significant. That's about approximately 40% of the overall funding that's being just part of the funding strategy for the overall housing long-range financial plan. So it's the main source of funding that we're using to fund that plan. So again, the program came into effect in 2023. There's three phases. There was a declaration phase, the appeal phase, and the audit phase. We've now completed each one of those phases. So we've actually been through a full cycle where each one of those phases have been through their first full cycle. Obviously, on the declaration phase, we've been through a couple cycles, but when you look at the full appeal and the audit process, we've now completed one full cycle of the different phases of the program. Staff are here to provide a very detailed, wholesome analysis and update on that. We have lots of data. We've done a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of what that data is telling us, and that's what I'll pass over to my colleagues Joseph and Lance to walk through the next slides and provide more details on that. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Cyril. So the following 4 slides summarize the results of the 2023 VUT cycle. The program successfully engaged property owners and informed them of their new obligation to complete an annual declaration. Various communication channels were used to raise awareness of this new program. And Ottawa outperformed any other municipality in Canada using the annual declaration model. In the first year of the program, the city received declarations from 99.6% of all eligible residential properties. Ottawa surpassed tous les autres municipalités canadiennes utilisant le
Ottawa
modèle
did better
de
than any other
déclaration
Canadian municipality with the annual declaration form. During the first year of the program, the city received the declarations at 99.6% for all eligible residential properties.
Declaration online, which resulted in a significant increase in enrollments for the city's My Service Ottawa platform. This back on. This increase will help keep residents connected and aware of future property tax and VUT obligations. In the second year, staff saw a decline in inquiries regarding accessing and completing the online declaration form. Next slide, please. After completing the declaration, appeal, and audit phase, the city has now actual measured scientific data on untenable vacancies for the first time. Ottawa had 3,672 units in the 2022 occupancy year, or 1.1% of all eligible residential units. Ottawa comptait 3,672
Ottawa had 3,672 vacant units for the occupation year 2022, so 1.1% of all admissible or eligible units.
The vacancy issue in Ottawa is more severe than originally anticipated. Ottawa's vacancy rate is aligned with Toronto and Vancouver, which had vacancy rates of 1.25 and 1.17% in their first year of the vacant unit tax program, respectively. Next slide, please. According to MPAC data, 13,317 residential homes were sold in Ottawa in 2022. The VUT program identified 3,672 vacant units in 2022, which would have represented a 28% increase in housing inventory in the market had these units been available. Had these 3,672 units been made available on the market, they would have had a significant impact in the supply and demand pricing model, thereby putting significant downward pressure on home prices. Si les 3,672
So
logements
if those 3,672 units had been available on the market, the impact would have been considerable on the supply and demand system. There would have been a lot of downward pressure on prices.
Increases the overall affordability of housing in Ottawa. Next slide, please. And I will now pass it on to my colleague, Lance.
Thank you, Joseph. So in the first year, the program generated $12.6 million in revenue, $1 million of which came from the VUT audit program and $10.8 million from the declaration process. The city incurred $2.3 million in administration costs in 2022 and 2023 to implement and operate this new program, with approximately $600,000 of these administration costs reflecting sunk startup costs required to develop IT solutions and processes. After recovering the program costs, the remaining 10.3 million in funding was allocated to the city's housing LRFP. This funding is equivalent to 51 fully supported affordable housing units. Next slide, please. Plusieurs améliorations ont été apportées au cours de la
Several
deuxième
improvements
année
were brought during the second year of the program to meet the problems that we met during the first year. To facilitate access to the declaration form, the Client Service Center were busy receiving the declarations of the owners. This is another option for the residents who are not comfortable with technology or have only limited access. The declaration form was also made available earlier so we could extend the period of declaration and reduce the increased number of information requests like it was the case in the first year. The coordinates given by the owners on their declaration the first year helped us improve the specificity of the information on the second year, which translated into a better conformity of the declaration during the second year. The staff also updated the form during the second year in order to improve its user-friendly and to help the owners give exact information. There was a reduction of 74% of calls from one year to the other, or appeals, sorry. Next slide.
With the completion of the first year of the VUT program, staff now have the necessary data to assess and compare the annual declaration model against alternative models. Alternative models reviewed by staff include voluntary declarations, in which owners of vacant properties are required to self-declare when vacant, and periodical and event-based declarations, where declarations are mandatory but on a reduced frequency or when an event occurs, such as an ownership change or a building permit. Staff observed three key findings. The first finding is that continued public awareness is a key success factor for the VUT. Reducing or eliminating the annual declaration will severely damage awareness of the program. Staff studied Toronto, which had a successful first year in identifying vacant properties using a mandatory declaration. However, in their second year of the program, they failed to run a comprehensive communications campaign, leading to over 160,000 undeclared properties and over 60,000 complaints. The conclusion is that the public will quickly forget their obligations without consistent communications and reminders, resulting in an ineffective program and increased administration and enforcement costs. The second finding is that alternative declaration models introduce financial risk. Alternative declaration models were found to identify significantly fewer vacant units, decreasing the VUT revenue by up to 80%. Revenues from alternative declaration models methods are estimated to be between 1.5 and 2 million annually, which would barely cover the cost to deliver the program and significantly reduce or eliminate funding for the city's housing LRFP. The third finding stems from significant trends observed in occupancy changes. The preliminary analysis of the declaration data from the second year indicated a significant change in occupancy status from one year to the next. The preliminary year-over-year analysis found that 1,785 properties, which were vacant in 2022, are now occupied in 2023. 1,600 properties were vacant in both 2022 and 2023, while 1,700 properties became newly vacant in 2023. And this data indicates a need for annual declarations. Based on these findings, staff recommend maintaining the annual mandatory declaration, which has proven to be the most impactful and successful model for targeting vacant units. The annual declaration model ensures strong public awareness and regularly reinforces the need for property owners to keep homes occupied. Next slide, please. Staff have been pursuing enhancements to reduce the burden of the annual declaration for property owners. Later this year, the city will be implementing an enhancement to the My Service Ottawa property tax portal introducing a new VUT dashboard that will give residents easy access and visibility to their property's VUT status. The dashboard will have one-click buttons to access the declaration form and any other VUT form they may require, such as audit or appeal forms. Where action is required, the portal will flag an outstanding action which needs their attention. This is one example of enhancements to be introduced in 2025 to make completing your declaration as easy as possible. I'll now pass it back to Joseph to go through proposed staff recommendations.
Thank you very much, Lance. The next two slides, next slide, please. Okay. The next two slides provide recommendations for further improving the program based on data from the first year and stakeholder feedback. First recommendation is an update to the property code eligibility. Property use codes determine which property codes which properties must declare and comply with the VUT program. Property codes form part of the property assessment data provided by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, or MPAC. Staff recommend removing property code 211, as these farm properties were found to contain abandoned century-old farm structures, which would not be considered part of the housing supply. This change would be effective 2025 onward. Staff are also recommending the addition of 4 property codes that were found to contain residential units that should be considered part of the city's housing supply. These additions would be effective from 2026 onward, ensuring property owners receive sufficient communication before their requirement to declare. The next recommendation outlines 4 new exemptions. The first new exemption recommended is for rural ineligible properties. Staff have heard from several rural property owners who hold a property with a century-old home or structure that may have been a home decades ago, but has since been repurposed and is incapable of being turned into housing. This exemption could be claimed by property owners of rural residential century homes, recreational hunts, camps, or structures significantly damaged and incapable of housing use. The structure must be on a property with at least 5 acres in rural zone. It must be uninhabitable as determined by the city, and an appeal must have been filed to MPAC. This exemption would be effective for the 2023 VUT cycle and beyond. The second new exemption recommended is for hazardous and damaged properties. This exemption would apply to properties that have become uninhabitable due to hazardous conditions or substantial damage from a disaster outside of the property owner's control. The exemption does not apply where the disaster or the damage or the hazardous condition was caused by the neglect of the owner, and it can only be claimed for 2 consecutive years. This exemption would be effective for the 2025 VUT cycle and beyond. The next new exemption would apply where a property was, secondary property was periodically occupied by the owner, their spouse, dependent, or caregiver to receive medical treatment or assist a family member requiring medical treatment. This exemption would be effective for the 2025 VUT cycle and beyond. Lastly, an amendment to the renovation exemption is recommended to allow for upfit renovations that do not require a building permit, yet make the unit uninhabitable due to ongoing work. The renovation must be completed and the unit must be occupied within 1 year of the start of the renovation. This can only be claimed once per property owner, property and owner. Essentially, it is a one-time exemption. La rénovation doit être achevée.
The renovation must be finished and the unit must be occupied within the year following the beginning of the renovation. This renovation can only be obtained only one time per property and property owner. Therefore, it is a one-time exemption. Next slide.
The next recommendation has to do with the graduated tax rate. Having reviewed the preliminary year-over-year data, staff noted that around 50% of the properties that were vacant in 2023 are still vacant in 2024, indicating resistance to the current measures in place. In recognition that the vacancy issue in Ottawa is much more significant than anticipated and in line with cities like Toronto and Vancouver, which have increased their VUT tax rate from 1% to 3% across the board for their 1% or to 3% of the property assessments, staff are recommending something different for Ottawa. We're recommending a graduated tax increase for the VUT. Staff recommend that the tax rate for the first year of vacancy remain at 1% of the property's assessed value. But if a property continues to be vacant, the tax rate will increase by 1% for each consecutive vacancy year, up to a maximum of 5% of the property's assessed value. The tax rate would then reset to 1% after 1 year of occupancy. Staff estimate that the graduated tax rate would have generated $4 million in revenue for the 2024 cycle had it been in place. Le personnel estimait que ce taux d'imposition progressive
So this graduated VUT would have brought in $4 million estimated for 2024.
For the 2025 VUT cycle and beyond. The next recommendation has to do with a late appeal. In the second year of the VUT, staff heard from a few residents who were occupying their homes and charged the VUT in the first year, but did not file an appeal for the 2023 cycle because they were unaware. Although the current program allows for late appeals under extenuating circumstances, staff have received approximately 100 requests for late appeals that do not meet the extenuating circumstances criteria. Staff therefore recommend a late appeal window, allowing for an appeal to be filed at a fee up to December 31st of the following year in which the charge was issued. This, in effect, provides an additional 15 months beyond the regular appeal window to file an appeal. Processing late appeals requires significant amount of effort from staff to receive, communicate, review, and make a determination on the request, adjust, restate revenues on a closed cycle. A modest cost recovery fee of $500 is recommended for each late appeal filed per property. This change would be effective retroactively to the 2023 VUT cycle and beyond. And an additional one-time 6-month extension will be provided for late appeals for the 2023 cycle to ensure sufficient notice and time is offered to residents due to the timing of this report and the impending December 31st deadline. Finally, staff also recommends some minor administrative updates to the VUT bylaw to clarify some terminology and definitions. Merci, Monsieur le Maire. C'est la fin de notre
Thank you,
présentation.
Mr. Mayor. This is the end of the presentation.
So before we get to questions, we do have 3 motions that I'm aware of and 2 delegations. So we'll go to those first. I'll ask the movers of the motions to introduce their motions and start with a motion from Councillor Derues.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much. I have a couple motion. The first one is amendment to include property codes. Whereas on March 23rd, 2022, Ottawa City Council approved the implementation of a residential vacant tax unit VUT program through the residential vacant unit tax report. And whereas since its implementation, Council has provided direction to make improvements to the VUT in response to concerns that have been raised by residents, leading to this joint committee's consideration of the report entitled Vacant Unit Tax Program Update on Year 1 Data and Improvements. And whereas the report being considered today recommends the addition of 4 different property codes as eligible property codes identified as code 244, 245, 261, and 262. Whereas each of these property code capture property that are either managed forest property or have a portion being farmed And whereas the city 2023-2026 strategic plan has 4 strategic priorities, one of which a city that is green and resilient. And whereas Ottawa has a vast agriculture and farming community which produce unvaluable goods for both the local, provincial, and larger worldwide economies. And whereas during a time of concern regarding the potential impact of climate change, as well as the impacts of food insecurity that are routinely mentioned in the city, it does not make sense to potentially impose additional taxes on property that contribute positively in both areas. Therefore, be it resolved that the Joint Committee recommend that Council amend the report by deleting the follow property code from Table 6, such that they are not recommended as eligible property codes in the vacant tax unit bylaw. A, property code 244, which is managed forest property resident on water. And B, property code 245, managed forest property resident on water. And C, property code 262, land owned by farmer improved with non-farm residents, with a portion being farm.
Thank you, Councillor DeRuz. I understand you have a second motion as well.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and the second one is concerning rural property exemptions. Whereas one of the recommendations within staff report vacant tax unit program, update 1 year, only year one data and improvement, propose a rural exemption for residential dwellings such as century homes, recreational hand camps, or structures that are significantly damaged and not capable of being used for housing. Whereas one of the requirements for the property to qualify for the exemption is that the dwelling must be on the property with at least 5 acres. And whereas there is likely residents in the rural area that could possibly qualify for this exemption based on the identified type of residence, but may not qualify based on the acreage element described in the report. Therefore, be it resolved that the rural property exemption piece of the report be amended to allow property owners of rural residential century home, recreational hand camp, or structure significantly damaged and not capable of being used for housing apply under the following criteria. 1, the structure must be on a property which at least 3 acres. 2, the structure must be on a property in rural zone. 3, the structure must be uninhabited as determined by the city. And 4, an appeal must have been filed with impact. Mr. Mayor, just quickly, I want to thank staff, Joseph and his team, and Cyril on their leadership and working with my office and myself to making sure those both motion, by the way, are supported by staff. And we've been discussing lots behind the scene on it. And they share with me the concern we have in the rural area, because we, as we always say in the city of Ottawa, we're sometimes in the rural area, we have some property they literally cannot be declared, and they've been hearing us and listening to us. So I want to thank the team for allowing me to bring those 2 motions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor DeRuz. Next, we have a motion from Councillor Lowe. You'd like to introduce that now?
Thank you, Mayor. There we go. Whereas the vacant unit tax was approved by City Council on March 23rd, 2022, whereas Section 3 of the VUT bylaw includes a suite of exemptions to ensure property owners with valid reasons where their eligible property/properties to be vacant for more than 184 days are not unfairly taxed. And whereas those exemptions are rigid and only recognize situations that produce official documentation like certificates, agreements, orders, and permits, among others, ignoring the dynamic realities of home ownership or being a small landlord. And whereas there are various other equally valid circumstances for a property to be vacant for more than 184 days, such as the new exemptions proposed by Report Administrative Council Submission 2024 FCS Revenue-6, Vacant Unit Tax Program, update on year 1 data and improvements. Whereas the additional 1% in property taxes from the VUT has placed significant financial strain on homeowners, and whereas the changes to the VUT in the staff report is an indicator of its nascency and the need for fine-tuning, thereby recognizing many homeowners may have been unfairly caught by the tax. And therefore be it resolved that staff be directed to review rejected VUT appeals from the 2023 and 2024 declaration years and retroactively apply the new exemptions noted in this report. Be it further resolved that property tax accounts with retroactively accepted appeals under the new exemptions be credited the amount in VUT paid in those 2 declaration years towards future property tax bill or bills, minus a cost recovery administrative fee. Be it further resolved that a special reserve account be created and funded by the proceeds from the 2024 VUT declaration year for the purposes of the retroactive appeals process and property tax credits. And be it further resolved that staff report back by memo or IPD at the following milestones. Upon completion of the retroactive review process of rejected appeals from the 2023-2024 declaration years, when all credited amounts are issued to accounts associated with the retroactively accepted appeal, and upon the closure of the special reserve account. So the point of this motion is the substantial changes staff are proposing in the main report highlights the fact that the program needed to be improved, and which means we weren't being completely fair with our residents. The VUT cast a huge net that caught a lot of homeowners who had all sorts of life situations that did not produce the same type of documentation required by the existing exemptions. I'll come out and say it, as staff do not support the motion because it does take away from new money for affordable housing and may create a fairness issue, as only previously filed appeals will be reviewed instead of all accounts. And furthermore, changes to taxation regimes are typically made on a go-forward basis, and I'd be happy to speak to it on a little more later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for articulating the opposing point of view. Councillor Menard, I believe you have a motion too.
Thank you very much, Mayor. It's a request to the province to expand the VUT power to include multi-residential class. Whereas the top term of council priority this term is affordable housing, and whereas the vacant unit tax generates revenues for our capital budget for affordable housing, and whereas the VUT also incentivizes the return of vacant rental units to the market, and whereas the VUT only applies to the residential property class, which is limited to properties with less than 7 dwelling units. And whereas the VUT is not applicable to the multi-residential property class, which includes properties with 7 dwelling units or more. And whereas the VUT should not unfairly target small landlords who are more likely to be members of Ottawa's community and to be making less profit as a landlord than owners of large multi-residential buildings. And whereas the province should therefore allow municipalities to apply the VUT to a property class that is characterized by large corporate landlords who can most afford to pay. And whereas such an expansion of the VUT's applicability would see more revenues generated for affordable housing in Ottawa, disincentivize vacancy in large buildings, and create greater fairness between large and small landlords. Therefore, be it resolved that on behalf of City Council and the City of Ottawa, the Mayor write to the Premier and the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to request the VUT power be expanded to the multi-residential property class. Thanks, Mayor, and thanks to staff for their support on this.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. And just before we go to delegations, I'll just clarify and reinforce if staff could just comment on the 4 motions. My understanding is that staff are supportive of the 2 motions from Councillor DeRuse and the motion from Councillor Menard, not supportive of the motion from Councillor Lowe. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move to the delegations now, beginning with Cheryl Parrott.
Good morning, everyone. I have to say, we're thrilled about this whole vacant unit tax. So we came to budget 4 years ago in November of 2020, and we spoke about the need for a tax on vacant residential buildings, which we had a number in our community. So the first year of the pandemic, we saw many people sleeping outside in tents and using Tom Brown Respite Center when we had 8 vacant properties within 1 block of the arena. And most of the buildings had been affordable rentals that were in very good shape, that were bought for speculation and tenants evicted. And some had been empty for a decade, most for at least 3 to 5 years before November of 2020. So we were thrilled when staff very quickly did the research, and this bylaw was passed by council in June of 2021. And it is making a difference. So it took a little while to gain any momentum, and I don't have a lot of patience, so I was somewhat frustrated. But we now see it working. Your stats show it, and we have seen the success. So in Hintonburg, as I said, I mean, it took a while to really get moving, but we currently have 8 new housing projects underway. which will create 71 new units that are replacing 16 units that were in 9 vacant, very derelict buildings. So these new units, of course, are at much higher rents, but they will add to the housing stock. And the citywide stats that were shown are proof of the success. So having 1,785 properties vacant in 2022 that were occupied in 2023 shows that it's working, and this is huge. And we agree that the annual mandatory declarations are required to keep the list accurate. Your stats show that as well. So this will also save you money by helping to reduce the calls to bylaw for these derelict properties in Hindenburg that were constant bylaw issues and also being broken into. So it saves on police resources as well. And of course, we're thrilled to see the 10 million going towards affordable housing. And the audit program I thought was really very interesting. So it was surprising to see that almost 9% of respondents were deemed non-compliant in the audit. So that's a really important component. And we support the progressive increase in the yearly requirement as an incentive to speed up redevelopment. One recommendation for you is those declaring by phone, please ensure that you have a system in place for a callback, just as you do when you call 311. If it's going to be a long wait, you get an option where bylaw will call you back. But that didn't seem to happen, certainly in the first year, maybe even in the second year. And people were waiting on the phone for an hour and finally just gave up. So that's extremely frustrating. And I do support Councillor Menard's motion, because what we are seeing is a lot of new multi-residential buildings, so buildings that have maybe 30, 50 units in them, are having trouble renting their properties out. And so what we're seeing is, rather than keep them vacant, we're seeing short-term rentals in them, which is not the point of increasing the housing supply to create hotels in communities. So I do very much support Councillor Menard's motion. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, Cheryl answered my question. I was going to ask her if she supported Councillor Menard's motion, and if she saw this as being valuable in her community. I think you've kind of answered that. And so I take it you're seeing a significant difference since the VUT has been put in place. And by the way, I appreciate your points on making it easier to apply, especially for seniors, for older adults. And I don't, if you have any further suggestions on that, I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, we are seeing the difference, but it took a while. It's only in the last, I would say, month or two that we're seeing this development all of a sudden ramp up, even though the interest rates are much higher than they were back in the pandemic when it was 0.25% interest. So I really believe that this has forced the issue of, get moving, because some of these were a decade, many of them were a decade to 7 years that they were empty. And yeah, one of our big concerns, and I'll be coming later in to other budget committees, is we are seeing so many of the new bigger apartments with vacant units in because the prices are high. And so they are turning to short-term rental, which is just the opposite of what we want when new housing is being built.
Thank you very much for your advocacy, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanaugh. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll add my thanks, Ms. Parrott, to your delegation as well. I always appreciate hearing from you. I appreciate your comment about the derelict buildings that you see in the immediate neighborhood, and how the introduction of this particular tax has moved the yardsticks on, getting derelict property owners to take action. So I appreciate that. Do you differentiate in your mind, though, between derelict properties and non-derelict properties and the use of the VUT?
Well, we'd like to see all the properties used, but in our experience, most of them are not well maintained and are derelict. We had one that had been vacant, I believe, for years. I believe it's now sold, that nobody knew was vacant because it was so well maintained, better maintained probably than my own property. It was immaculate, but had been vacant for, I think, at least 4 or 5 years. So it's the loss of housing. But in our experience, almost all the other ones except one, and I think we had about 100 properties, were constant bylaw issues. So grass, broken windows, and nobody did anything. And the vacant property permit is starting to work a little bit, but trying to get people to actually get the permit and to fulfill their duty to come every 2 weeks and keep a logbook has been difficult. And I understand bylaw is now starting to issue fines if the logbook cannot be produced when your grass is 4 feet high. Clearly you weren't there 2 weeks ago.
Fair enough. I don't dispute with you the properties that are derelict need to be addressed. And but my question to you is, the association's position for the properties where the grass is not 4 feet tall, where the building is not run down, where the property is well taken care of, where there are no bylaw issues with the property. The association still believes and maintains that instructing private property owners what to do with their homes is the right thing to do. You're comfortable with that?
Yes, I am. Absolutely. I think, as a collective effort, we need to make sure that the housing is used, that it is not set aside for some other purpose, even if it is well maintained. Most times we're not going to know that nobody's not, that it is vacant if it is well maintained. And there may be others in the community like that, but we're not aware of them. It's the derelict ones that come up on the radar, but I feel that yes, housing should be used.
Yeah, I mean, we could take this further and say people who have vacant bedrooms in their homes should be taxed. People who have backyards that haven't built coach houses should be taxed. I won't ask you how many bedrooms in your home are underutilized, but maybe $10,000 a year tax for every bedroom, for every backyard that doesn't have a coach house, since the city of Ottawa the residents have not taken up on coach houses. Multiple years now that we've allowed coach houses to be built, very little uptake. I raise this not because I support that. It's just at what point does a government, step over the line to dictate how people use their private property and their private residences? I'm not sure how many people would support taxing for every underutilized bedroom a special tax because they're not fostering a university student or sponsoring a family. People would say, well, that's none of your business to tell me how to use bedrooms in my house. How dare you? But for people who are opposed to the VUT, they take exception to the fact that the city is telling them how to use their homes. So I appreciate Hintonburg's position. I do think you do have some unique challenges in the neighborhood, and I do appreciate sincerely your delegations today and in the past, but I just wanted to articulate that there are some serious concerns out there in communities, despite the fact that the money is being used for very, very noble purposes. And I do want to support more housing in this city. It's just how we acquire those revenues to do that purpose. But thank you for your delegation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. I just remind councillors that we're asking questions of delegates, not rebutting or engaging in debate with them. Let's move to the next delegation. John Dickey is our next delegation. Go ahead whenever you're ready, sir.
Good morning, Mayor and councillors. Thank you for hearing from me. Next slide, please. I will try to be brief to cover the necessary ground. And first of all, let me say that EOLO does support a number of the staff positions. if we could go to the next slide, please. We support the enhancements numbers 2, 4, and 5. We support the exclusion of the farms in enhancement 1. We take no position on the inclusion of properties in enhancement 1. We oppose two main things. In enhancement 3, the staff proposal for an increase in the VUT rate for vacancy in consecutive years. And we also oppose the call in Councillor Menard's motion to expand to the multi-residential class. I will say one more thing. We also do not oppose the annual declaration. That seems a very practical thing, which again seems to work. And certainly in terms of a number of the details, the staff report has been very good in terms of details and setting things out. What we did not see in the staff report, which I regret, is any sense of a review of the working of the VUT in the context of these points that Councillor Brockington was addressing, that there was nothing in the report that I could see in which staff had made any effort to find out why some owners were keeping some units vacant. And I can think of 5 or 6 reasons which are not currently covered in the exemptions for which people would want to keep units vacant. And to me, many of them are sensible things that a person might want to do. And in any event, if they own the property, it seems to me at least, and I think to many other people, that they should have the right to do that. That's what's involved in owning a piece of property. So the next slide, please. So that's the main objection, that I think if this is meant to be a review of the VUT as a whole, it simply doesn't meet that test. I would submit that the proposal to increase the rate so dramatically without that review of the program as a whole, which we were promised 2 years ago, and I think promised again a year ago, I think is not appropriate. It is something council should not be doing at this stage. And I have some suggestions for how you can still move forward without so badly, I would say, turning down the expectations that people have that this thing should be looked at. So now if we turn to the next slide, please. The other thing that is not in this report is any look at other cities. I would say more cities in this country get along fine or get along without a VUT than have a VUT. The focus is on Toronto and Vancouver, the 2 cities in the country with the worst housing problems, but most cities, many more cities, including cities more the size of Ottawa, do not have a VUT at all. So next slide, please. So my overarching suggestion would be that the council should direct staff to find a consultant who would consult with the property owners who are willing to talk to the consultant about why they hold units vacant, and consider the options for a VUT in an even-handed way, including the pros and cons of the current system and any increases in the rate. Next slide, please. But I realize that you probably want to move forward today. And so I have a number of suggestions for how you could minimize the risk of overreach while still moving forward. And my first suggestion, I think the most important one, is that this proposed increase to a 2% rate for consecutive vacancies should only be brought in 2026 based on vacancy in 2024 and 2025. Because if it's brought in 2025, the owner cannot do anything to avoid it. Mr.
Dickey, that's time. So
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind just wrapping up in a few
All right.
seconds, that'd be great.
That slide shows the suggestions, and it's basically in 2024, there's only 2 months left. So, and staff said to me, we could owners knew, well, we might be increasing, but they didn't have a concrete suggestion until this report. So those are my suggestions, and I'm hoping that some of the councillors may put forward some of these suggestions, or at least have a good discussion of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dickey. Councillor or Vice Chair Gower.
Thank you. Thanks, John. In Ottawa, we do have a vacancy rate, at least at the end of 2023, of 2.1%. And the price of rentals and of resale and new housing is out of reach for even people in a medium income. So we are in a housing crisis. You mentioned there are 5 or 6 reasons you could think of that would justify having vacancies that continue for more than 1 year, 2 year, or longer. And I think it's important in the discussion today. What are some of the reasons that people would have for longer term vacancies?
Well, one of them is, for example, someone who has a family member in the city. Suppose I lived in Kingston and I had a child with grandchildren in Ottawa, and I want to come and visit them. And I want to visit for periods of a week at a time. Well, it's expensive to stay in a hotel for a week at a time. It might make sense for me to buy a home and come for a weekly visit every month. And yet that's not my principal residence. And under the current rules, I would be subject to this VUT. And if I keep doing that for 5 years, say it's a condo worth $500,000, the city is then going to want to charge me $25,000 a year to use this property that I bought so I can visit my family. Another reason is if I want to move into a new unit on my retirement. My retirement, let's say, is going to take place only in 2 years, but I don't want to put a tenant in there because they might bring in a cat, and I'm allergic to cats, because they might damage the place, because they might not get out when I need them to get out. I want to keep it vacant. But that doesn't qualify because it's not my principal residence. I know landlords who don't rent a unit because right next to that unit, there is a disruptive tenant, and they're trying hard to get the disruptive tenant out, but they don't want to move a new tenant in next to the disruptive tenant because they have regard to their reputation. They don't want to inflict a disruptive tenant on a new tenant. Those are 3 reasons. Then there are the land assembly reasons that Cheryl Parrott addressed, that again, if you have a major development, 1 tenant out of 20 units can foul up, delay a development, cost a developer hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and slow up the redevelopment of 100 or 200 or 300 new housing units that the city desperately wants. So we have to take the rest of the world as it is. And if the rest of the world is such that 1 tenant can delay a development, then it makes a lot of sense for a landlord, when a tenant has moved out voluntarily, not to put another tenant in there if they expect a development to go ahead within a year or 2 or 3. These are all sensible reasons in my mind for an owner to keep a property vacant. And I don't think city council should be second guessing people on those decisions.
Okay, thank you. I disagree with you, but we'll have more of a discussion with staff. So thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Vice Chair Gower. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Dickey, did staff reach out to you to consult on this matter before the staff report was publicly released?
No, they did not. They did not tell me it was released. They had no discussion with me about this, even though I participated in the discussions last year and 2 years before that quite extensively. I was busy as heck, and fortunately I noticed this about 4 or 5 days ago. I will give them that they responded to me quickly when I asked for clarification. The first thing I asked for clarification was about this business, about whether this 2-year rule was going to take effect in 2025 or 2026. I said, surely it's just going to take effect in 2026. And they very quickly said, no, we're planning to bring it in 2025. So they got back to me quickly, but there was no consultation with me. And I think I was one of the major stakeholders who was involved a year ago and 2 years ago. So I'm frankly, I'm not very happy about that, although I will say they responded quickly.
Fair enough. Just the scope of outreach that you do yourself with your members who are part of the organization. Have you specifically asked them for their comments and feedback on the tax after it was implemented? What type of outreach have you done?
Well, I've done outreach. They're not happy with, they're very unhappy with the tax. Again, it seems every time we turn around, one level of government or another level of government wants to impose new requirements and new costs on us. Everyone talks a good line about, oh, we want more housing, we want more rental housing, we want you to be part of the solution. And that's what's said on Monday, and then on Tuesday, oh, but we want you to tell you to run how to run your business, charge you a new tax. And, oh, we don't think that reason's a very good one, and we don't think the other reason's a very good one, when they don't walk a mile in our shoes and they don't know what the real costs are and how we have to operate. So, you know, I appreciate Mr. Gower asking me the question, but, you know, he's not the one trying to develop rental housing, and we are. And the other thing that certainly our members, many of our members are larger developers who would be affected, or owners who would be affected by the Menard motion. But even some of them are affected currently because they operate rental property, which is in condo title. And property in condo title is subject to this. So they're having to fill out these forms. There is this requirement to fill out the forms. And unit by unit, there's no provision for being able to fill out the form and select that it applies to 100 units at a time. No, it's every form. They go in, and through My Ottawa, they go in and they fill out the form. And if you know, now there's to be this provision, if there's a cosmetic renovation, that they don't need a building permit, so that's some help. There have been some tweaks to make this better for them, but I certainly know of two major developers in this city who are holding units vacant because of a land assembly, or not a land assembly, but 2 or 3 separate land assemblies, because otherwise their projects may be delayed, and we may not get the new housing that we need in a timely manner. And yet they're being dinged, and at the moment it's 1% they're being dinged, $5,000 on a $500,000 building. But according to the staff, it may mount up to be $25,000 a year. This is great. Sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional about this. I think this is over the top.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that. My last question just is, one thing I've heard from every small landlord that's come to talk to me since the tax was implemented was their challenges with the tribunal, the timelines with the tribunal, and an opportunity cost of leaving a unit vacant as opposed to having to rent it and go through the tribunal again and all the challenges there. Can you just talk quickly about whether this is a contributing factor through your communications with your members as to why some landlords might keep a unit vacant?
Well, I would. To be frank, I think they tend to compartmentalize the two problems. In other words, the LTB is a problem, and certainly an owner, a number of the things I referred to before have to do with the delays and the problems of the LTB. So for example, the example of I buy a unit and I want to move into it for my retirement, the fact that the law is such that I can't stop a tenant from keeping a cat there, even though I'm allergic to cats, that's an Ontario landlord-tenant problem. The fact that if the tenant damages the place, or I can't move them out quickly to move in myself, that's an LTB delay problem. And that would certainly be a reason why, a partial reason why the landlord would keep the unit vacant. And then it seems unfair that then the city comes along and layers the VUT on me as an owner for doing a perfectly sensible thing, which another level of government is kind of causing me to have the problem. So, you know, in some ways it's good that the right hand of government doesn't know what the left hand of government is doing, but in other ways it's bad. Does that address your question, Mr. Brockington?
I appreciate your comments, Mr. Dickey. I'll just leave it there and allow my colleague who's on the list here to go ahead, but thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Curry.
Thank you. Just a quick question. John, thank you very much for what you've sent us and your comments today. I guess the challenge I'm having is that the people who've already been fined would very likely have reasons for holding their units vacant that they might find to be good reasons. So I think the argument that was made originally when we went down this road is that the concept of the vacant unit tax was government overreach. So I just don't understand the part where you're saying, I agree with some of it, but I don't agree with the extra part that we're adding on here now if it remains vacant, because I think if you sit on a issue, you sort of think this is either government overreach or not just at a point it is. So I just wonder what you think of that.
Well, I at least try to be a practical person. And while I'd like to see the whole, I mean, in my heart of hearts and as representing our members, we'd like to see the whole thing scrapped. But I know also I'm getting nowhere with that. But I did hope that there might be some balance. And I thought that the balance might be, let's stick with the 1% rate generally, which frankly, I do approve of staff suggesting we stick with the 1% if the vacancy only lasts a year. I mean, it's not my worst problem or the thing I object to the most that it goes to 2 years, as long as people know that's happening, which could only be done if it starts in 2026. I'd like to suggest that it only goes to 2% in 2026, and then it stays there for another year. So you have 2 years at each tier, and then it stops. You don't approve going beyond 3% now. I mean, heavens, Vancouver and Toronto stops at 3%. So why not, go up only to 3%, and then you can come back in 2 or 3 more years if you feel you need to go further. So to answer your question, again, to circle back, I'd rather see the whole thing scrapped. But 3% is better than 5%, 2% is better than 3%. Doing it in 2026 is better than doing it in 2025.
Okay, thanks a lot, John.
Yes.
Mr. Dickey, thank you for your presentation, for answering the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll open it up to committee members to ask questions or make comments. Councillor DeBruce.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I got a few questions. Can staff clarify how we came to the recommendation to add in property code 261 and eligible property code under the VUT bylaw?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So these new properties that we're adding came to our attention through phone calls and feedback that we received from a lot of property owners in the first year and in the second year who are unable to make a declaration to the city. And therefore, we commenced an investigation trying to find out what kind of property codes they were sitting in and why they were not included. And so we identified 4 primary property codes where we did further inspection, and we found that there were actual units. In terms of 261 is property that is owned by a non-farmer that has residential units on it. So this determination, again, is made by MPAC, and they make that determination by going through, especially in the rural area, for property that is being farmed. They correlate or cross check that data with all the applications that are made to the AgriCorp to make sure that these are not farmers and that these are either private citizens and or developers that own these pieces of land that have homes.
Thank you, Joseph. Through you, Mayor. So follow-up is, how does the city or MPAC knows that those are developer and not farmer, or not? Basically, we're forgetting that maybe it could be small farmers still own the land in between those. And maybe also follow up also with that. What is the process? Let's say if it happened to while we're enforcing and we put the 261 code to implement it as a VUT, what will happen if say we find out after we implemented that there is a small farmer or farmer owned we missed it in between those two, between this process.
So I'll speak to what TEMPAC has informed us. So they determine that, properties that go into that non-farmer code, they determine that it's not a farmer, either by one, again, cross-checking with all the data that has been submitted or the applications that have been submitted to the AgriCorp. And I would say, of course, that there is tremendous benefit for farmers applying to be designated as a farm through AgriCorp because it gives them an 80% reduction in property taxes. The other way that MPAC does this is through inspections. And if by in the event that, say, you have these one or two that perhaps were not caught, we do have a process in place. You can always, appeal to MPAC or, put in an inquiry with MPAC. MPAC will update the property code and they will no longer be eligible and will not be charged the tax. So there is a way to deal with these fringe cases and we have a mechanism for that.
Perfect. So if we certainly come across some of those, we'll probably come and be able to discuss it and put them through the process and to help them making sure that they identify as a farmland and they're not as a developer. Am I correct?
That is correct, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. And thank you, Joseph, for the question, answering the questions.
Thank you, Councillor DeRuz. Councillor Dudas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't think that what I say next is going to come as any surprise to any of my colleagues or to any members of the public. I continue to have grave concerns with the administration of the VUT, and I will not be supporting the report as it is before us today. The intentions of the VUT as a means of returning vacant properties to the market is admirable. But to continue to say that every single household, more than 300,000 in our city every year, should file their declarations is overreach. It's completely overreach. The fact that staff in their presentation said that the annual declaration is required, otherwise, quote, the public will quickly forget their obligations. It's unacceptable to me. It's not the responsibility of a senior who has lived in their home for 40 plus years to annually remind the city that they still inhabit their home. And that's just one of the examples that I've been hearing from my residents and residents from across the city. The obligation, the onus, should be on the municipality. The city can figure out how to collect taxes from property owners. It should not be a stretch for the city to assume the responsibility for identifying problem properties that are consistently vacant and can be logically returned to the market. The administration protocol for Ottawa's VUT was set up copying the gold standard set by Vancouver. Toronto and Hamilton also use the Vancouver model. We now know that Toronto has called their administration an absolute failure. Over 165,000 homes in Toronto were charged the VUT in that municipality. Toronto fired the staff involved, scrapped the late fees, throwing out this gold standard, and rewrote the whole program. Their council approved a new process in April of this year, and we still don't know if that's going to be successful until everyone does their filing. Hamilton paused their tax. They're holding off till next year, and we still don't know what that's going to look like in that municipality. So while I appreciate the aspects of the staff recommendation before us, in particular, the increasing of exemptions, at the end of the day, I cannot support the report because I do not believe that assuming our residents are guilty until proven innocent is the right thing to do.
Thank you, Councillor Dudas. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate the work of staff on this project. I know it's not the most popular project in the city. I certainly know that. But I continue to support the reason why we have it, and that is to bring us more funds for affordable housing. This is crucial. As chair of Ottawa Community Housing, I see the need, and people don't want their taxes raised. I think asking them to fill out a form once a year is not a big ask. It may be a pain, but it's not a big ask. So I appreciate it. I do think there was a good suggestion in terms of older adults who do not have computers and are phoning in. If there can be some kind of a callback system for those who need assistance, we want to help those that do not have the capacity to use a computer. Is that possible?
Mr. Mayor, we actually do have the callback option implemented this year. So in the first year, we did not have that feature. And being the first year, we had significant wait times, but this year we've seen that the wait times have reduced in the sense that people are calling at different points of that 2 to 3 month window that they have to declare. And if there are wait times, there is an option to call back.
Okay, thank you. Well, one of the things that I've learned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're getting more people to sign up for the My Service. Is that correct? Which helps them in the long term.
Yes. So I think one of the elements, I think that, or one of the biggest wins I think we've seen from the VUT is the tremendous uptake in the use of My Service Ottawa as a self-serve tool. We've seen our property tax registrations go up from about 100,000 to 250,000. That is almost 2/3 of all of our properties across the city are now on My Service Ottawa. They can self-serve and receive and do things that they were not able to do before. They had to call the city to get help with.
Thank you. I understand that staff support Councillor Menard's motion. Can you elaborate on how that would possibly work and possible revenues?
We do support the idea of an inclusion of multi-res because the VUT program as exists today only applies to residential properties with 6 units or less in per property. Therefore, the picture that we have before you today is not complete in terms of housing units. Inclusion of multi-res would give us the full picture in terms of trying to bring more units back into the market. Staff haven't done a deep dive in terms of what this would mean in terms of additional revenue, but what we can say is that we probably have an additional 150 to 200,000 additional units in the multi-res bucket.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that, and it just seems so wrong when we're talking about people who can't afford rent at this time. So there's definitely a disconnect, and the idea that somebody buys a house just in case is, if they can afford it, that's wonderful. But there's so many people out there who cannot afford their rent, never mind a house. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. I've lost my train of thought now, but I may get back on the list. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Vice Chair Gower.
Thanks, Mayor. So although I disagree with the delegation on some of the reasons given as justification for additional exemptions, I think the question asks about why are units vacant is really important, and it wasn't something in the report. Is that just because it's the program is relatively new? We don't have that data. Are we asking why units are vacant when they're assessed a vacant unit tax? Can you provide any information there?
So, Mr. Mayor, you are right. The program is still relatively new. We are just reporting on first-year data. We do have plans to sort of do a deeper dive in terms of understanding why some of these units are vacant. We have seen some trends, however, in terms of what we hear from people through the appeals process, in terms of why these units remain vacant. Some people, there's a couple of different big buckets that we can see. I think some are generally developers waiting for the right time to bring their units back onto the market, or do some construction and or retrofits to their property. The other trend that we've seen is we have a number of foreign mailing addresses. We're yet to dig a little bit more into that, but at a high level, those are the two key trends that we've actually seen. Some of the other reasons we've addressed through the exemptions that we're bringing forward, where we think that it is vacancy that we would consider, or the city would consider, tenable, by, for example, expanding the renovation exemption to allow for that one time. We did hear from a lot of people, saying that their units are vacant for one reason or another, due to, say, an upfit.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there's one circumstance that I've become aware of, but I think the new medical exemption may cover it, but I'm going to follow up with staff offline. In my ward, this year, the whole process was so much smoother than in year one. If we had 8 or 9 complaints, I don't think we had any more than that. They were mostly around the process. There were a few just who were philosophically opposed to the vacant unit tax for various reasons. We did have 2 or 3 of that set around the audit process. Can you just talk a little bit about specific changes to the audit process that you've made in response to any feedback or what you've observed?
Mr. Mayor, thank you for that question. So in terms of the audit process, again, this was our first time doing it. And yes, we did have some technological challenges at the beginning in terms of the solution that we had provided. Those issues have since been resolved, and therefore the folks that were sampled for audit later on in the year or early this year did not experience any of those issues. The other thing I will say is we did find through the different audit campaigns that certain audit campaigns did yield higher vacancies than others. So we will in future plan to focus on some of those. So those are the 2 big improvements I think that we would expect to see as we move forward with the audit process.
So like kind of a risk-based audits based on where you're seeing the most issues.
Yes,
yeah.
Mr. Mayor.
Okay. I mean, you've highlighted how this appears to be meeting the goals we set out for the vacant unit tax. And each year we get a bit more data and understand how we can target it better, how we can address exemptions. But, compared to Toronto, where they have had a lot of issues, I think Ottawa's been really successful over the past 2 years. So looking forward to seeing data and information and the revenue over the next few years as well. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Vice Chair Gower. Vice Chair Kitts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To start, I just wanted to thank staff for exploring and implementing the direction that I brought forward earlier this year on late appeals. I'm glad to see that residents will now be able to file a late notice of compliance for a cost recovery fee. We know that there's a myriad of reasons why a resident may have missed the deadline, but charging those full pop for what is in fact their primary residence, I don't think was ever the intention. So thank you for that. In terms of next steps for residents who reached out regarding the 2023 cycle and have kind of been in limbo waiting for this update, will they be contacted directly pending council approval?
Mr. Mayor, should council approve the recommendations that we have here, we do have a list of about 100 residents who have reached out to us. And should this pass, then we will be reaching out to them directly and asking them to, providing them with that option if they would like to proceed.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. While I do continue to share some general criticism of the program expressed today, and the burden of the annual declaration process, I do think that if this program is here to stay, that the recommendations in the report do improve the VUT. So I will be supporting it. And I wanted to thank my colleague, Councillor Giroux, for the motions he's bringing forward as we shared some of the same concerns regarding agricultural properties. I'll be supporting both of those. And just a final clarification question, perhaps to Caitlin. Perfect. The report or all the recommendations are bundled together. A colleague was asking if there is an opportunity to separate those out.
Mr. Mayor, the recommendations before the committee is a single recommendation as it relates to approving receiving the update and then approving a series of program changes. Should a member of council wish to dissent separately on a particular program change, that may be possible if it is a separate and distinct proposition as laid out in the report. So there are 5 separate and distinct program changes that are laid out in the body of the report that is my preliminary opinion, would be divisible if requested.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Kitts. Councillor Tierney.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Joseph and team. As you know, when we first started this, I was very vocal of my opposition at the beginning, but I've watched the evolution and the work that's gone into it. So I have a couple of quick questions. First of all, back in the day, I asked, is this going to be simple checkbox? And I think we stumbled out of the gate initially, but now that we have those videos and the tutorials, what was a little more complex in the past where you had to think about things, especially if you had multiple properties. I have to do some declarations for my mother's property, for example. It was a little complicated. Since then, can you confirm with the use of video, the tutorials, the messaging we put out, it's now reduced to a simple what we were hoping for, that simple one button click. Is that now in place? Because last year seemed pretty simple to me, unless I was missing something.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Mayor. So yes, the first year, of course, was a little bit rough in the sense that it was a new program, new process for people. There were some learning opportunities for us. It took probably about 2 to 3 minutes to complete the declaration the first year. In the second year, we've made significant improvements. It's down to a minute or less. I think some could argue 30 seconds, but we are making more improvements in 2025. And we will continue to make improvements every single year to make it as easy and less onerous for people as we move forward.
Great, thank you. And for the audience behind the curtains, I'm still very critical in certain aspects, and you always address it. Even through the app, it's so easy now because, let's face it, people use their phones a heck of a lot more than these things anymore, and I find it's very easy to do. The other questions I had, when it comes to just in general right now, if we see derelict properties, and I'll tell you, I have some homes surrounding my neighborhood, people are always saying it's depressing the property values of my home because that one's falling apart. And I always have to get the calls in about getting property standards to go over. Who foots the bill on a lot of these things? Obviously, there's a cost for resourcing to go mow someone's lawn and tack it onto their bill. Like there is a cost to the city every time we're doing this. Do you feel that the vacant unit tax will give that opportunity for people to say, yeah, maybe you should think about putting your house in the market if you're going to continually do this because it's creating a bigger issue and a cost to taxpayers?
So I can say for a fact, I'll let Cyril talk to the cost side of things, but I can say for a fact we have seen several derelict properties, either one start to get renovated and or put back on the market and sold. I think we heard from the delegation too, from the Hintonburg community that they've seen specific identifiable properties that they can speak to on a day-to-day basis. So the program is working. We are seeing a lot of these derelict properties and property owners sort of making the decision that it is no longer tenable for them to keep these properties vacant and not do anything. They're better off selling them or putting them back on the market.
I think Cyril's nodding. I think that covers it off. You're a terrific ambassador of that. When it comes to I just want to make sure I don't get cut off. Are we open here or do I have to go back on the board after a time? I want to make sure I get everything in here.
You're good.
I'm good. Okay, I won't get cut off. Thanks, everyone. So when it comes to the email list, I think this is the most important feature of all. We've witnessed some environmental emergencies, catastrophes, power outages, floods, you name it, daytime parking bans, where we want to alert the public and make it easier for them or give them that messaging. What was it like prior to the VUT versus now? In regards to contacts we have for people and our ability to press that emergency messaging or warnings out to save people some money for not parking on the street during a winter parking ban?
So, Mr. Mayor, I'll speak specifically to the VUT program. Prior to the VUT program, I think we probably had close to maybe 80,000 emails that we could utilize to reach out to people. Now we have, I would say, close to 320 or 29,000 emails that we can actually use to reach out to all of our property owners who registered within the VUT. Now, specifically in terms of how we use that data, I think we're still working, through that component with our privacy counterparts to see where and how that data could be leveraged, if possible, under the MFIPA legislation.
Great, and I think that's the hottest area, 8,000, 300,000. Postage ain't cheap, folks. So if you can get people to get online with everything, we're saving taxpayers money at the same time, as well as giving the opportunity for people to move their car out of the way while we're clearing our streets, while we're getting massive new winter storms that we've never had before. When it comes to ward by ward, do we have, and I think we have our best tools in councillors that have connections to our wards. I go far out of my way, and I make no apologies about sending out extra communications, printed or otherwise, to make sure people are fully aware. Do we know is there specific wards that are stumbling, that are not able and might need assistance to get the information out to their constituencies? Because I'll tell you now, I can count on one hand how many people have come to me.
Mr. Mayor, I would say in terms of the compliance and making those declarations, I think it's the folks that have not declared. When we look at the non-compliance, it's fairly similar across all wards. I wouldn't say that there are any specific wards that really jump out in terms of non-compliance.
Great, and we do the additional mailings in advance with the original tax bill. So a lot of people like to say, oh, I didn't know, but I mean, it's really, I think the email lists are going to be a big benefit. I think there's no way not to see this, I don't think. And am I missing an opportunity to get the message out? Is there something else? Do we run radio ads?
So, Mr. Mayor, I will say in the second year and following council direction to utilize that email and phone information that we gathered through the first year's declarations, we have seen tremendous success and a reduction in costs in terms of mailing. So in the first year, we had to be very conservative and we sent mail out notices to everyone. In a second year, we used email and we used it very, very effectively. We used it effectively not only to notify people, but also to control when they declared so that they were not all receiving notifications at the same time and were receiving tremendous call volumes. And emails are so much easier to deal with. We don't have a lot of lead time in terms of getting things to the printer and distributing this information out. It's instant. Whenever we send out emails, we would almost see immediate jumps in declarations. Within an hour or two, we would see spikes. And when it came down to the very last few, and when you get to the 90% range, especially as you get closer to the deadline, we were able to send multiple reminders to people to make sure that they were constantly made aware. So we've seen tremendous benefit in terms of using emails to continue to notify people. And that has been, I think, one of the lessons or one of the lessons learned or one of the benefits I think we've seen within the Ottawa program, say compared to the Toronto program where they're still doing mailouts.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think a lot of the councillors, depending where you are going to see differences. There's a lot of people that don't have derelict properties around them because their houses are all new or they're only 30 years old or whatever the case may be, versus a neighborhood like mine that's more established, where you're seeing a lot of these older homes just falling apart and depressing the values in the neighborhood. So I'm quite satisfied with what I'm seeing. I like the fact there's an option for people to file if they have an issue. I like that channel. And you've always been very responsive by voice and otherwise to everyone that we contact. You actually contact them half the time yourself directly, which is unbelievable. So that being said, I do, Mr. Mayor,
Councillor.
I'm just going to go ahead and I do have a bit of a direction. If it's okay, I can introduce.
Yeah, if you can introduce that quickly, yeah.
So I'm going to put it in the screen, and it's just a simple direction because I think when it comes to property taxes in general, I think we even saw it in the East End consultations. A lot of people are unaware of what's on their bills. So I thought this would be a good opportunity, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for working with me on this. That the staff report back as part of the 2025 draft operating and capital budget Finance and Corporate Services Committee on December 3rd, and provide the breakdown of the back of the tax bill to illustrate the total taxes collected in comparison to total taxes retained by the municipality with details of individual amounts. Because I find every time I go somewhere and I mention, you give us $5,000, maybe for your taxes, 1,000 goes to RVCAs, it goes to the province, it leaves us 4,000, there's 1,000 for transit, it keeps whittling down to, we have a very finite amount of money. And what a good opportunity to put in the fact, if there is VUT components, I just want to make sure we segregate the bills correctly. And I've worked with you in your office. Are you satisfied with that, Cyril?
Mr. Mayor, yes, I'm good with that direction.
Great. Sorry to yammer so much, Mr. Mayor. I had to get it all out.
Thank you, Councillor Tierney. Councillor Lowe?
Do you want me to just go at the end as a wrap up? That was what the hands.
Sure, if you choose. Yep. Councillor Menard?
Thanks very much, Mayor, and appreciate staff's work on this, and the changes in the report make a lot of sense. I also just, when residents email me about this, you're very responsive to them, and our percentages have been going up in terms of responding to this. It's quite easy to respond. Councillor Tierney's comments were well taken. I wanted to just ask about Councillor Lowe's motion and where the concerns come from. Obviously, I guess in tax policy, just like federal tax policy, when you implement something, it's there for that year. And then going forward, you've got it there and changes are made. Those changes are made from that year forward. But going back, I think is the concern that exists around, things like if they had a transit pass incentive where we had in Ottawa for a long time. That was new and started that year, but we didn't go back and give people a transit pass for the year prior if we didn't have the policy in place. So I want to just hear from your perspective, like, is that the concern, is that we'd be going back and changing tax policy, or is there other concerns that you've expressed? Because I didn't hear a chance to opine on that motion.
Mr. Mayor, I'll kick off, and if Joseph wants to add or top me up after that, he can do so. I think between yourself, Councillor, and Councillor Lowe, you did a good job in terms of framing our reservations. The reality is, to your point, we're making a decision. If this is decided on by committee and ultimately on council as a move forward basis, going back opens up, Pandora's box of precedents in terms of everything. At the end of the day, where do you stop it in terms of going back and applying a decision today in, kind of back to the future type approach. So there's a significant issue with that concern. There would be an impact of, we're estimating about $3.5 million impact for this as well. So that would have to be, withdrawn from the commitments in the affordable housing plan to put aside to address those concerns. And there's also a fairness component of this as well, in terms of people would have applied based on the previous regime of exemptions and process. If we're now introducing new exceptions, will that lead to further people that could or did not appeal because they didn't see the intention of appealing at that time? So again, it's really a very, something that we don't support from that perspective, and it would kind of create lots of issues, administrative costs, and then decisions going forward as well.
Mr. Mayor, to add on to that, I think the fundamental difference in terms of why we're recommending this to go forward, other than being best practice, is that this is a change in policy. We're not saying that the people that were charged in 2024 or in the last 2 years were unfairly charged. They were charged in accordance and very we intended to charge them because that was a program that was in place. So the changes that we're bringing in are changes in policy, and generally those are on a go-forward basis. We're not trying to correct for a problem that had happened in the past.
Okay, no, that's understandable, and I know, just to Councillor Lowe's, I guess, motion, I have some property owners in mind that have raised an issue around an affordable care home, seniors housing, and I know staff have indicated that appealing is the right move at that time, and then we can work through some of those issues on the appeal. You know, have had meetings with them where it seems like these issues are getting resolved. There's some issues with MPAC and the overlap in terms of how they classify a property versus our own rules. And so it's been helpful to work through that issue on the appeal, which I think the Councillor Lowe motion speaks to. My experience has been that those have been successful in those discussions with staff to this date. So that's helpful. Just on the DeRuze motion, I think it was the first motion that was clause C. I think I'm going to support both of the motions from Councillor DeRuze, but the first motion on clause C, I think it was a property that would add an additional residential unit on the property, but the property is farmed in some way. I think that's what it's getting at as an exemption. I'm just trying to understand better, because the other two made sense to me. If it's a rural woodlot, that you know, that's not going to be available for widespread housing, right? But this one is if you're building an additional house or a lot, and there's some part of the property that is farmed, that one wouldn't be classified. Or maybe you can clarify for me what that one is.
So, Mr. Mayor, the classifications come to us from MPAC. So the 4 that staff were recommending, including and then the 3 that Councillor DeRuze's motion recommends to be removed, all have residential units. Not residential units that will be built. They are residential units there, and we found this out by residents calling us and saying that they were not able to declare. So we investigated and determined that they should be included. I think Councillor DeRuze's motion speaks to the fact that I think, as he outlined in his motion, that there could be farming and or managed forest benefits that sort of come from those properties. And therefore, I think there's a recommendation to perhaps exclude them due to the potential of, say, derelict and or century homes and so on and so forth.
Okay, so it wouldn't apply to new units created on those sites? Like, let's say there's a 4-unit building created on those sites. Would those then have the VUT stipulations applied, or is this just for pre-existing?
Mr. Mayor, it is possible that if new units were added to that particular property, the property code might as well change, could very well change. MPAC may then come and reassess the primary use of that property and change it to something else, which would then trigger them to be eligible for the VUT.
Okay, that makes sense. I'll be able to support both of the DeRuze motions as a result. Just on the motion that I brought, obviously this is a request to the province. We'd have to come back and weigh it and discuss it amongst staff, but right now we don't even have the ability to look at it. And this would give us the ability to look at it. As I understand it, MPAC data shows that there's 13,317 residential homes which were sold in Ottawa in 2022, and the VUT program identified 3,672 vacant units in 2022. We talk a lot about supply around this table. I don't think there's any better program for adding supply than this program. There already existing supply, right? It's more affordable than the incentives that we're giving for a lot of other potential supply or expansion of the urban boundary. This is probably the most affordable way to get supply. So for people that make the supply argument, a lot around here, I do too, on affordable housing, certainly supply. This is probably the best program we could have to actually get some more supply on the market, which is the entire part of it, and the most affordable way to do it for the municipality, with people that are most able to pay, right? It's not all property taxpayers, it's people most able to pay this. So that's, I think, an important aspect of this piece. I'll just ask staff again, just on my motion, the request would be to the province. The province right now doesn't have this on their books, but you would make that request to them to say, this is something that we're interested in, because right now it's limited to the 330,000 residential units of properties with less than 6 units, of which about a 1% vacancy would be yielded. Oh, sorry, Mayor.
It's okay.
And this would, I think, add, 130,000 more to that 330. That's my last.
Mr. Mayor, that is correct. The request would go to the province, and should they approve and or bring in new legislation that would allow us to apply the vacant unit tax to multi-residential properties, there is a potential of between 150 to 200,000 additional units being eligible for the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Councillor Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a comment. Will be supporting this, and I am challenged by this, I must say, but we sit in the service review working group meetings and we constantly ask, what other ways can the city bring in revenue? Like, where else can we make money as a city? And I tell you, often all of our great ideas result in no. The answer, no, we can't do that. Legally, we can't do that. And so this is one of the ways that we can. And so unless the municipal funding model changes with the province, there's a lot of talk of that. Unless that changes, we have to keep using the tools that we have. This is one of the tools we have. We can legally use it, and then we use it for good. I just think we have to do that. I mean, in another world where there was different, grants, funding model for municipalities, maybe we wouldn't. But right now, I think we do have to do this. So, if sometimes people are confused by the way people vote on this, this is the way I look at this right now. And I will just make one other point in that, we have to have a balanced budget as a city. I think if we didn't, I'm glad we do, but I think if we didn't, maybe people would make different decisions. But because we do, and we want to fund what we want to fund, we go down this road. So I will be supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Curry. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to be clear that the original intent of this tax was not to build affordable housing. The original intent of this tax was to take existing housing that is not being used for housing purposes and put it back on the market so people can live in it. That's the intent. The intent of speed enforcement cameras is not to raise a pile of cash for the city. The intent is to slow traffic down. And the goal is not to raise one penny. We want those cameras to be the incentive to slow people down. And so the threat of a tax, we hoped, would incentivize homeowners that were not using their homes for the purpose of residential to put them back on, either rent them out or sell it, but make sure these homes are used and people can live in them. That's the intent. So if we want our coffers to be filled with affordable housing dollars, we need to tax the people of Ottawa to ensure that we are fulfilling that obligation, like any other matter. So my opposition to this historically has just been, I don't think it's my business to dictate to people how to use their homes. As long as the home is being used for what it's zoned for, you're not engaged in criminal code activities. I draw a line of what I, as your city councillor, wants to investigate what you're using your home for. But given the will of council, and given that this tax is the current reality, and given that we have a recommendation for us to expand this and increase the tax, I have a few questions for staff. And that is, if the intent of the tax is to put housing back on the market, at some point we're going to hit a floor. At some point, there'll just be no other houses left to convert back. There will be a number that for whatever reason, homeowners have decided not to use for housing, but we'll hit the floor. There will be no more additional houses put back on the market. So the question becomes, what other reasons to have this tax? If the basic intent is to get houses back on the market and we hit the floor, then if it's just a money generator, we have to at least be honest with the people of Ottawa that this tax is in place for that purpose. But there will come a time where, homeowners say, look, I don't want to pay this tax anymore. I'm either going to rent it or I'm going to sell it, and we're going to floor out. So does staff envision, or was there any thought given to a sunset clause on this tax? Our intent was to take what we thought were thousands of homes not utilized for housing, get them back on the market. We've converted thousands. We're seeing a trickle down now year after year. It's time to end this tax. I'd like to hear staff's thoughts on this matter.
Mr. Mayor, it's a great question. I think the reality is, that would be the goal. The goal is to be in that situation where we're not faced with, the housing crisis that we're faced with today. And I think that's one of the things that you're seeing in this report and the continued commitment from myself, Joseph, and the team is, this is a key area where we're actually using the data. We're coming back to council. We're sharing the data. We're making sure that we, analyze the data and provide opportunities to improve the program. So, success would be, for me, there's no housing crisis in the city and there's no longer a need for this. So those are things that we're going to continue to report back on. We're committed to providing reports back to committee and council on this on an annual basis. And if things, move the way we want them to move, for sure, we'll revisit at that time and bring that back to committee and council to provide that direction to staff.
Yeah, I think this should be a serious consideration. Is there a limit or a cap or a sunset clause to this tax? I have strong reservations with 5% after 5 years. I think, Mr. Dickey's only one delegate, but I think an amount less than that. And starting in January of 2025, is there any benefit to delaying until 2026 to allow the market, homeowners, associations time to understand that there's an increase coming and give them some time to renovate, put that unit back on the market, sell, and avoid being taxed as of 2025?
Mr. Mayor, that's a great question. So our proposal to start the graduated increase effective 2025 is really informed by the idea that if we have a unit that's been vacant in the first year of the VUT, it's vacant in the second year of the VUT, it remains vacant in the third year of the VUT when the 2% rate would apply. Even if we did delay it to the fourth year, there's no indication and there is no data that would support that particular unit would actually go back to the market. Those units that would have been vacant for 3 years are vacant for a reason. The measures that we have in place clearly are not working. And therefore, I think what we've seen in other jurisdictions, such as Vancouver and Toronto, that have a similar program than what we've done to the one that we have, is that they've actually tried to tackle this by increasing the rate, which has proved to be more effective as a deterrent and as a motivator in terms of getting these property owners to do what they need to do in terms of getting the units back to the market. So there is nothing to indicate that those consecutive vacancies would actually do anything different if we did delay this a year or even 2.
And Mr. Mayor, maybe if I could just, sorry, Councillor, if I could just throw in one little tidbit of information as well. As a reminder, the clock resets January 1. So the 184-day threshold of being vacant, that resets January 1. So, technically day 185 is when that, charge starts to be coming on the ticker of being us sending the bill out, just for context.
That's appreciated. Thank you. My last comment is just something I've said before at committee and or council, and that is council has already approved, just in River Ward, over my tenure, multiple projects that sum up to just under 10,000 units that have not yet been built. Along Carling, between Maryville and Clyde, I've said this before, and Councillor Leeper and I share this border, 24 towers have been approved by us. 3 have been built. So interest rates, definitely a contributing factor. We've done a lot of the work that we needed to, that we're responsible for. And again, I look to the private market to say, your municipality has approved these projects some years ago. We have a housing and homelessness crisis in the city, a declared emergency. They need to build. So the VUT was a small ingredient to the bigger problem. There are many other contributing factors as to why housing is not available in the City of Ottawa market. So I just wanted to point that out as well. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did have one example to bring up that we've talked about already. And this is a very unusual situation that should be considered for the future, and that's of a vacant house that where the applicant has got approval to build 21 units and is waiting for the city to move forward on giving them permission to go ahead and getting a demolition permit, but is being charged that that is a vacant unit. So I think that's something that has to be looked at and corrected, because in that case, it's directly to actually create more units, affordable units at that. So I just wanted your comment on that. You already have it in hand, and if that is possible to look at.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So at the inception of the program, we did look at this specific issue, and we had a lot of consultation around whether if there were site plan approvals that were ongoing, which we knew takes several years sometimes to complete with the city, if an exemption was warranted. And the conclusion, I think after lots and lots of consultation, was that if a property owner is going through a site plan application with the city, the unit can still very much be remain occupied during that period of time and provide housing. We've seen lots of units in pristine condition that continue to remain vacant because the developer is going through a site plan approval process that potentially could take several years. And so the conclusion was that that particular home could be used as a home for somebody that does not have access to a home for that period of time as they go through the site plan approval. And once they have received what they need from the city and they pull a building permit, then the unit could be vacated, of course, and construction could begin. There is an exemption provided that they have a building permit in hand.
Thank you. I think it also speaks to the fact that it takes a long time to get things built. And I think that's one of the frustrations. And notwithstanding that we do have that are a lot of that have been approved, but I think we have to look at our process, because it's not the intention to have a vacant unit, it's the intention to build more. So I think these are things that we have to look at overall about our process and how we can speed things up so we can get those units built. But to the points of Councillor Brockington, yeah, this was about freeing up housing that is being left vacant. That's what this vacant unit tax is about. We're not, it's raising money for affordable housing. And I appreciate that that's, wasn't meant to be the end goal. It's just like the speed cameras, but we want people to understand how important having a home is, and leaving it vacant means you're denying somebody of a home. And so I appreciate the work's being done and the reason why I have this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Councillor Lowe, did you want to wrap up on your motions?
Sure. Thanks, Mayor. I know I articulated the opposing points very well earlier, so I guess now I'll speak to why I believe this motion is good, why I'm supporting it, because I'm moving it. I don't agree with the VUT policy overall. I do believe, however, the staff report does make the policy better, but we must also show fairness to our city's homeowners for the reasons I'll note. Taxation is a social good, but it must be fair and it should never be used as a punitive measure. The substantial changes staff are proposing in the main report highlights the nascency and the need for the program to be improved, which means we weren't being completely fair with our residents. Yes, residents were fairly charged in the sense that it was based on the policy at the time, but the VUT cast an unfairly large net that caught a lot of homeowners who had all sorts of life situations that did not produce the same type of documentation required by the existing exemptions, situations a policy sometimes just can't account for. For example, in my ward, Robert and Meg in my ward rent out their basement and were set to take on a new tenant just a few months after a previous tenant moved out. But the new tenant ended up having their job contract in their previous city extended and ended up not moving to Ottawa. The added vacancy period while they searched for and vetted a new tenant pushed them over the 6-month mark and got them a VUT charge. That wasn't their fault, and I don't believe that's fair at all. On the issue of reviewing previously rejected appeals only, it does mean a number of homeowners subject to the VUT to whom the proposed exemptions would apply will be missed. However, it would be administratively challenging to expect staff to reopen the appeal process for the 2023 and 2024 declaration years citywide. It's unfortunate, but it is a necessary trade-off. I'm proposing such a motion only because the program is so new. Had these changes been introduced after year 5, year 10, or whatever of the VUT, I would not have proposed this. It's the substantial changes proposed in the main report so early in the VUT's life that highlights the inadequacy of the policy as originally passed. So I hope you will support me in this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lowe. I'll just offer a few quick comments. I want to thank councillors for your meaningful contributions and questions on this topic. I want to thank staff for the work that went into this. I have always had concerns and reservations about the vacant unit tax in principle. However, I think staff have made a lot of effort to improve the dynamics around it and address some of the concerns that were raised. To me, it's still an imperfect solution, but as Councillor Curry said, we're dealing with imperfect circumstances where our goal is to put more housing back on the market. Our goal is to raise some money for affordable housing as well. And if it's able to do those things, I can live with it for the foreseeable future. And I appreciate that staff have made an effort to improve the program. I appreciate and support the motions from Councillor DeRuse and the motion from Councillor Menard. I'm not supportive of the motion from Councillor Lowe. I don't believe that these kinds of policies should be applied retroactively, and it would cost a lot of money to go back in time on that. So I won't be supporting that. So if we could, I guess first on the first motion from Councillor DeRuse, which is the amendments to the proposed included property codes. Is that carried?
Carried.
Okay, and then on the second motion from Councillor DeRuse, which is the rural property exemption. Is that carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Okay, and then if we could have a recorded vote on the motion from Councillor Lowe, please.
Councillor Luloff,
Yes.
Councillor Dudas,
Yes.
Councillor Curry,
No.
Councillor Kelly,
Yes.
Councillor Kavanaugh,
No.
Councillor Johnson,
No.
Councillor Tierney,
No.
Councillor King,
No.
Councillor Troster,
No.
Councillor Brockington,
Yes.
Councillor Menard,
No.
Councillor DeRuse,
Yes.
Councillor Lowe,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gower,
No.
Vice Chair Kitts,
No.
Chair Leeper,
No.
Mayor Sutcliffe,
No.
11 nays, 6 yeas.
Okay, thank you. And then on the motion from Councillor Menard, is that carried?
Carried.
Okay. Can we note the dissents then? Councillor Dudas, Councillor Brockington. Anyone else dissenting
On the report?
on the Menard
No.
motion? Okay, just those? Okay, thank you. And then recorded vote on the motion as, or the report as amended then. Please, and if people want to indicate their dissent on a certain item within the 5 items, they may do so, but otherwise we'll just vote on the report in total as amended.
Councillor Luloff,
I'll register dissent on items number 1 and 3. Thank you.
Councillor Dudas,
No.
Councillor Curry,
Yes.
Councillor Kelly,
Yes, with dissent on items 1 and number 3.
Councillor Kavanaugh,
Yes.
Councillor Johnson,
Yes.
Councillor Tierney,
Yes.
Councillor King,
Yes.
Councillor Troster,
Yes.
Councillor Brockington,
No.
Councillor Menard,
Yes.
Councillor Giroux,
Dissent on 1 and 3, please.
Councillor Lowe,
Yes, dissent on 3.
Vice Chair Gower,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kitts,
Yes.
Chair Leeper,
Yes.
Mayor Sutcliffe,
Yes.
15 yeas, 2 nays.
Okay, thank you. Let's move next to the Housing Services Long Range Financial Plan update. We have a PowerPoint presentation from staff. We have 3 delegations, 1 written submission. So we'll start with the presentation from staff, please.
Once again, good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, members of the committee. So I'm joined with Isabel and Derek. They're going to do the presentation. I'm not going to speak much on this one. I'm going to give myself a little bit of a break this afternoon, but they'll walk you through the update on the Housing Long Range Financial Plan. This has been a file that we've been kind of, I don't want to say we have been kicking it down the road, because we did provide an update last year. We made the commitment last year during budget that we'd be back again this year. As you're all aware, it's a very evolving, changing, fluid file, to say the least, in terms of different funding streams that we received and different strategies. So this is a good update that's before you today, and I'll pass it over to Isabel now to kick it off. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. So I'm joined today by Derek McMaster, Manager Planning and Projects in Housing Services. The agenda, next slide. So we'll go over the funding requirements for the next 6 years of the plan. We'll show you progress from 2021 to 2024 on the 21 LRFP. We'll talk about new affordable units, the new transitional housing requirements, new operating funding requirements, housing subsidies requirements, and then we'll talk about the proposed municipal capital funding plan and the forecasted funding versus. Next slide. So the updated 10-year housing and homelessness plan 2020 to 2030 was adopted by Council on July 15th, 2020. The plan had a goal to create between 5,700 and 8,500 affordable housing options of new units and housing subsidies targeted to both low to moderate income households. The Housing Services Long Range Financial Plan was presented to Council for the first time as a companion report to that 10-year plan in 2021. Since then, much has changed. The cost of construction has increased, financing rates have climbed, but we have also received significant financial support from several funding programs, both at the provincial and federal level, while the city has also increased its investments towards new affordable housing units, housing subsidies, and program supports. This chart shows the financial requirement over the next 6 years of the plan from 2025 to 2030, compared to the estimated funding from all 3 levels of government based on current known funding programs, adding in the city's proposed funding plan to 2030. And the difference in the last column is the funding that will be needed going forward, primarily in the last 3 years of the plan. The plan is well funded over the next 3 years, but it is the next 3 years post-2027 that funding becomes more uncertain and less predictable from both the federal and provincial governments, well, mostly from the provincial government. Le plan est bien financé pour les 3 prochaines années, mais c'est au
The
cours des
plan is
3
well
prochaines
funded for the
années,
next 3 years, but it's for the following 3 years after 2027 that the funding is more uncertain from the federal and the provincial government, but mostly from the provincial government.
The financial requirements summarized here is for 3,000 new affordable and supportive housing units, or 500 units per year for the next 6 years. 1,300 new housing subsidies annually, 7 new transitional housing facilities and 20 scattered homes, and 75 million in additional operating funds for the transitional housing supports, facilities, affordable housing supports, and programming. Next slide. From 2021 to 2024, 785 units were completed. And in 2024, there's an additional 438 units that are under construction. There's a time lag between the allocation of funding and construction completion. Some of the units completed may have come from previous funding allocations, and funding allocated in 2021 to 2024 may be included in units completed in subsequent years. Between 2021 and 24, including the capital strategy update that was provided today, the city has allocated funding to 1,164 affordable housing units. The 2021 long-range financial plan approved by council committed $14.6 million annually in capital funding for new affordable housing units. The actual contribution by the city has substantially exceeded that amount. The contribution was increased to $15 million from $14.6 in 2021, maintained in 2022, increased to $16 million in 2023, and an additional $13.3 million added from the Housing Services operating surplus in that year. Finally, in 2024, the allocation was increased to $30 million based on other potential sources of revenue, including the VUT revenue, vacant unit tax. The 2021 LRFP established a target of $20 million annually for the federal and provincial government. The federal government average annual contributions exceeded that target, and the provincial contributions fell short of that target. Furthermore, the target was based on the 2021 net equity requirement for affordable housing. But during the pandemic, that requirement per unit increased significantly, limiting our ability to achieve the targeted goal of funding 500 units annually. This LRFP updates that requirement and the funding strategy to address it. Next slide. The annual net equity requirement is the amount of funding required by nonprofit service providers to construct affordable housing. It includes the total development cost, net of fee relief, development charge exemptions, and any financing that is obtained by the service provider, for example, CMHC financing. Development costs were estimated $338,000 per unit in 2021 and have increased to $540,000 to $600,000 in 2025. Supportive units cost more than affordable and are at the higher end of the range. The model assumes 40% of units are at less than 70% medium market rent and 60% are at 100% of average market rent. Interest rates have also increased since 2021, and that this has contributed to the increase in the net equity requirement. If interest rates continue to drop, that will help to reduce the annual funding requirement. Overall, the net equity requirement for 500 units has increased from $65.5 million annually to $142.2 million annually, for an increase of 152%. Dans l'ensemble, les besoins en fonds propres nets pour 500 unités sont passés de 65.
The new equity per unit ranges from 2,000 to 350,000 per unit, and they went to $142 million for 2025, an increase of 150%. Derek McMahon.
This LRFP has increased the capital requirement for new transitional facilities up to 7. This is needed to meet the high demand for shelter services in our city and to achieve the city's goal of moving out of city recreation centers as well as hotels and motels. When we last did the LRFP in 2021, at that time we were only looking at 2 facilities, one for women and one for families. That has changed. This demand, with the lack of affordable housing and rise in single newcomers in our city, has required this drastic change. There is good news, however. With the federal government's recent budget, Immigration and Refugee and Citizenship Canada has announced an extension to the funding program called IHAP, or Interim Housing Assistance Program. This is promising, however, it is time limited and we must act now to take advantage of this funding that allows us to transform our transitional housing system. We are very optimistic that in our negotiations that we will be able to attract and negotiate up to $125 million in IHAP funds that could be allocated towards investing in our transitional housing system. The proposed strategy is outlined on the slide above. If you can flip to the next slide, please. and it includes the Corkstown facility. This was occupied earlier this year through a lease and houses over 130 families. Additionally, we've secured a lease at 230 Queen that will become operational in the coming months that will house singles. We have also recently acquired 1745 St. Joseph, a former nunnery that will be converted into transitional housing for newcomers in our city. And over the next 3 years, we look at acquiring and leasing several new facilities for families, for newcomer reception centers, and over 20 scattered homes throughout Ottawa to house newcomers as well. The $125 million includes the cost of acquisitions, renovations, and capital improvements and fit-up costs for these facilities. The operating costs and leases will be covered in the next slide on operating costs. By acquiring these transitional facilities, we can reach our goal of moving out of temporary facilities and building a service system that allows our residents to move successfully through transitional housing into permanent housing options. Next slide, please. This LRFP has also looked to increase our need for operating funding. This operating funding supports homelessness services and prevention, funding new supportive housing units that are built, and providing sustainable operating funding for the transitional housing described before. This is needed to meet the high demand for social services and homelessness in our city, and once again, to achieve our goal of moving out of recreation centers and hotels and motels. In the previous LRFP, we were seeking a range of $40 million per year in 2021, increasing it up to $92 million by 2030. We've made significant progress since that time, thanks to our partnerships with our federal and provincial governments and also this city. Recently, yesterday, the province announced the new deal with the province of Ontario that provides $40 million per year for homelessness services in our city. But as all this funding has increased, so has the demand for our services in our committee. Over the next 2 years, we have $70 million per year committed from the Ontario-Ottawa New Deal and through IHAP funding. Starting in 2027, we do not have further commitments for this funding. Therefore, there is a gap of $75 million per year. We do remain optimistic with the federal government's 2024 to 2025 budget, with a further reaching home allocation and with positive signs that we could see further funding commitments to reduce that gap in the near future. Why is this funding required? This funding, as mentioned, is to fund new supportive housing units that come online at a rate of 50 units per year, and that's incremental funding that's required. The 7 new transitional housing facilities require operating funding for staffing, contracts, and leases. As well, we look to partner with our community and social services sector on strategic initiatives to reduce inflows into homelessness and increasing outflows into permanent housing. Next slide, please. The last operating requirement is for new housing subsidies. The LRFP has increased this operating requirement for housing subsidies to $1,300 per year. This is almost double the need of $700 outlined in the 2021 LRFP. And this is also a significant increase from the service level proposed in our 10-year housing and homelessness plan that we'll be updating in the next year. And also keep in mind that this is in addition to all of the households that are served through our centralized waitlist for rent geared to income housing, and also some municipal subsidies that we also provide as well. These additional subsidies that we're looking to fund is significant. And this is why we rely on our federal and provincial partners through existing programs under the National Housing Strategy, like the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, or COB for short, to provide the city with funding for these benefits. To reach our objective of reducing chronic homelessness, housing subsidies are required to provide both choice and flexibility for singles and families in our housing system to move into permanent housing. Our projection over the next 6 years is that we need 13.7 million per year, incrementing by that amount every year. So it would be a $82 million pressure by 2030 and a total need of 288 million over the next 6 years. For context, our 2023-2024 allocation was 4.3 million and served 380 households. More is needed to be able to achieve our goals of moving households into permanent housing options. I will pass it back over to Isabel.
Thanks, Derek. Next slide. So this slide provides a summary of the proposed funding strategy for the municipal financial contribution to fund 450 new affordable and 50 supportive housing units annually for the remaining 6 years of the plan. The city contributes in many ways to the construction of new affordable housing units. This chart breaks it down between the capital funding that is predictable and sustainable funding each year as part of the budget process. This is shown at the top in brown. Then there's other potential and less predictable other sources of funding shown in blue. And then there are the other financial contributions that are provided in the form of exemptions that help to reduce the cost to developers to build affordable housing units shown in purple. The plan recommends that the base budget continue to increase by 1 million annually until 2030, reaching an annual amount of $15 million. This amount will be supplemented each year with the estimated vacant unit tax. Both of these revenue sources provide a predictable base funding amount each year that can be counted on. Therefore, for the 2025 budget, we would recommend setting a budget of 18.9 million for capital funding. And if the graduated VUT is approved by council, this amount would increase to 22.9 million for 2025. There are other potential sources of revenue that we can estimate, but which are less predictable, both in terms of timing and amount. In the 2021 LRFP and annually as part of the budget process, Council has approved a capital budget that relied on some of these other sources of revenue, some of which have not materialized. Therefore, the recommendation is that for all the projected sources of revenue in blue, they should only be included in the annual budget in the year after the revenues are received and not based on a projected amount. This will ensure that we don't overcommit funding, which is what has happened in the past 4 years and which will be explained further on the next slide. When you take into consideration all the financial contributions expected over the next 6 years, the city would be contributing between 30 to 42 million annually, including the VUT amendment. This doesn't even include the value of donated lands projected to be 20 million over the next 2 years. Next slide. So this graph summarizes the potential annual capital funding plan to 2030. The first 4 bars show actuals from 2021 to 2024. We funded 15 million in each of the first 2 years, then doubled that amount in the last 2 years. The funding level assumed a base budget allocation shown by the blue bar, which we have been increasing every year, combined with other potential sources of revenue in the form of debt, development charge revenue, surplus land sales, cash in lieu, and community benefit charge, all of which did not necessarily materialize. The dotted black line shows us what we actually received from all sources in those years. The VUT was added in 2024. The shortfall in revenues has created a deficit in the housing reserve of 15 million, which we will need to replenish over the next few years from any future additional sources of revenue. This deficit is not a cash deficit, but is a commitment deficit, meaning we have committed more funds than we have received, but may not have necessarily spent it yet. The last 6 bars represent our revised funding strategy to commit funding equivalent to the base budget in blue, plus the VUT in red, with the dotted red representing the graduated VUT that would need to be approved by council. The remaining funding would come from other sources of revenue shown in the green bar, but only committed after the revenue is received. Based on this revised funding strategy, the projected capital contribution could average between 24 million annually or 27 million annually with the approved VUT amendment. Sur la base de cette stratégie de financement révisée, l'apport en capital projeté pourrait s'élever en moyenne de 24 millions de dollars par an ou à 27 millions de dollars par an avec un amendement du VUT approuvé. Next slide. So this table summarizes the net equity requirement for 500 units annually, reduced by any affordable units built by developers as part of the Community Improvement Plan Tax Increment Equivalent Grant, conservatively estimated at 50 units annually in the next 2 years, and could potentially continue in future years if successful. The estimated net equity requirement in 2025 is 128 million, 18.9 million, and potentially 22.9 million with the VUT amendment would come from the city. We have included in this forecasted funding agreements and programs from both the federal and provincial government that we know of that are currently in place, and we can estimate the amounts that are potentially available. The projected funding from senior levels of government are very close to the net funding requirement in those first 3 years. We are not expecting any significant funding shortfalls in those next 3 years. What we do need is assurance of a continued or new predictable funding programs post-2027. The federal government's Affordable Housing Fund, which contributes up to $75,000 in forgivable loans per unit, and the Housing Accelerator Fund, which we estimate will contribute $118.8 million over the next 3 years, sufficiently covers the federal funding requirement in the first 3 years and potentially beyond. The provincial funding is less predictable. There's an estimated $65.5 million that could come from the Building Faster Fund over the next 3 years, but there are no other commitments from the province for capital funding over the next 6 years for new affordable housing units. OFI has provided $20.5 million in the last 4 years, but there is no commitment beyond 2024 at this time. Staff are also working with Ottawa Community Housing to explore the possibility of an OCH bond issuance, either from the city or by OCH, to advance more housing construction. Rather than distributing equity funding in the form of cash, a portion of the annual base budget contribution could cover the cost of debt servicing until the units are completed, and there's sufficient rent to cover the financing costs going forward. Funding for construction can then be advanced in the form of debt, but it would be OCH debt, not city debt, and it would have to be financially feasible to also maintain affordable rent levels. We are still assessing the feasibility of doing so. Next slide. So the report recommends the following: continue to increase the base budget by 1 million annually, continue to allocate the proceeds of the vacant unit tax to the housing reserve, discontinue the increase to the DC exemption budget for affordable housing due to the mandatory exemption now imposed by Bill 23, maintain a positive balance in the housing reserve account and repaying any deficits within 1 to 3 years, continue efforts to secure capital funding from federal and provincial governments for new affordable units, operating funding for new housing subsidies, supportive and transitional housing, enhanced support services, and increased emergency shelter funding. And finally, that staff explore the feasibility of offering debt financing as an alternative to direct equity contributions. So the key messages today are: the cost to build has increased. The city continues to step up by increasing the annual and predictable funding for capital. We need more support for operating. For capital, we are well funded for the next 3 years, but we need more predictable funding from senior levels of government post-2027, particularly from the province. This concludes our presentation. We look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And just before we go to questions from councillors, we do have 3 delegations, starting with Mike Bilthouse, the Executive Director of the Ottawa Community Land Trust. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning. So while I myself, on behalf of the Ottawa Community Land Trust, or OCLT, have spoken with most of you, I know that OCLT is still relatively new, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be with you. We are a nonprofit operating as a social enterprise, working to preserve and secure housing affordability in Ottawa and the region. Specifically, over the past 18 months, we've worked to build a model wherein we can acquire existing rental properties, naturally occurring affordable housing from the speculative real estate market, and place these buildings under community ownership to preserve affordability in perpetuity. I know you all know the data. We're losing more affordable housing than we're building, and you'll hear more of that this afternoon. I'm thrilled that there's traction for this work. And as there are sometimes questions, I want to take a few minutes to share this story and its potential. To preserve affordability, we know that a capital mix is necessary to buy, a combo of conventional mortgages, community investment, and potentially public and philanthropic capital. To this end, we're establishing a revolving fund that we can tap to respond to market opportunities. That capital mix allowed us to buy our first property in Carlington in late 2023, and driven by our first community investment campaign, this capital mix allowed us to buy a second property in Vanier this fall, a 10-unit apartment building. Interestingly, in 1956, this property was actually the first building purchased by the Greenberg brothers, became the first property within the Minto portfolio, and has now passed from one community builder to another. Now, in this capital mix, we're grateful for $150,000 from Councillor Plante's Section 37 funds, which amounts to $15,000 per unit. That amount represents the equity gap that we needed to close. Now, how did we get there? Community capital. To begin capitalizing our revolving fund, we invited the community to invest. In May, we launched sales of our first community bond, a term-defined investment vehicle working much like a GIC. Investors receive a financial return between 3.5% and 4.5%, and a social return through pooling investments for community or social impact. By September, just 3.5 months later, we met our initial goal of raising $1.7 million, and in response to oversubscription, have increased our goal to $3 million. That raise assured our lender that we have a viable financial pathway to preserving those 10 units of affordable housing. That raise allowed us to close on Brant. That raise was driven by community. Over 110 unique investors, the vast majority from here in the Ottawa region, individuals and families, community organizations investing their reserves, local businesses, small family foundations. This was new capital coming into our community's affordable housing crisis and efforts. This was community wealth building at work. And now with our goal of $3 million in sight, we're looking for a third and maybe fourth property, not to become another housing operator in Ottawa, but to support the sector's growth. We know that other nonprofits and charities in Ottawa that are delivering critical community and support services need access to more rental units. And we are in active dialogue with several, with the hopes that we can purchase a building to be immediately leased to them to operate, pooling assets in a single entity for greater financial leverage while enabling the stellar service providers to do more. And as the portfolio grows, we'll recycle our own equity into growth, establish or enabling a longer-term model that depends less and less on public subsidy. Now, we do believe this represents a new way of working, a way of working with community and potentially with governments. And it's a demonstration that any long-range financial plan for housing will go furthest when it leverages other sources of capital, not just federal and provincial, but community capital within the system, a whole of community financial plan. Our hope, and that's the hope of our board with its nonprofit, co-op, and private sector experience, is that public funds might support a diversity of approaches, including approaches that leverage community capital. Now, we're pleased to see some new ideas in the LRFP, such as debt financing to support service providers in launching affordable housing projects. And I hope these projects include acquisition of existing projects by community entities. In several weeks, you're going to receive a staff report to consider municipal support of rental housing acquisitions. My hope is that within your LRFP, you hold space to support a diversity of approaches, including potential support for acquisitions, preserving existing affordable housing, and making it permanent. I can also assure you that we and the community housing sector will be with you in pressing the federal and provincial governments for additional resources and to ensure that we avoid upcoming funding cliffs. We are here to work with you on that, but also to grow that pot even further, to grow the operations of existing important operators and service providers. We know this is an all hands on deck moment. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Very nice to see you here, Mike. We didn't actually rehearse this at all, but I am really glad to see you highlight the recommendation number 6 in the report. I do think it is one of the most exciting policy shifts that we might see from the City of Ottawa in this long-range financial plan, and I do think we need to spend some time paying attention to it today. I'm very glad you spent your time highlighting the work that has been done with your bond and the fundraising that you've done. It's demonstrated, a surge of capital that is possible if we create the opportunities for people to contribute, and the City of Ottawa could do a lot more to do that. So can you help me to understand how you, if you had your druthers, how you might imagine recommendation number 6 helping you in your work, what could the city do when it comes to debt financing or other guarantees, financial guarantees for lenders? What could they do as a capital or as a corporation with their credit rating and their reputation?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question and thank you for the comments on the work. I mean, I think that the access, the potential access to a significant pool of low rate financing would help stimulate significant efforts. I think when we purchased our last building, it was the ability to prove to our lender that we had capital available, even though we know we needed to repay, but a source of patient capital, low rate financing that would enable us to, over time, as rents are stabilized within a building, pay off that sort of bridge facility that we had. So I think that having access to that from the city would be incredible. I think that looking at some of that as debt financing as opposed to equity contributions also frees up more cash that can be recycled more than once. So it's not just a contribution into one project one time. It can be put into a project, repaid, and used again and again. That's the kind of revolving fund that we're trying to build, and I think that city contribution could help move that a lot further. And I think it would show to the community that this is a viable pathway, a viable mechanism that working together can go that much further.
And what are the other organizations and institutions that invested in that bond?
Yeah, we had five community organizations invest a part of their reserve. So we had 2 housing co-ops that actually invested some of their reserve. The United Way invested, the Lower Town Community Resource Center invested. We had the Centertown Community Health Center, a number of local businesses, and then some small family foundations. So I think we've really scratched the surface. I think we've heard that the community wants to invest in its own well-being, and it's a natural way for many organizations to live out their mission and vision using their existing assets.
Okay, and final question. I heard you use the phrase community wealth building. That's a phrase that was also used in our poverty reduction report. And I'm not sure that everyone has a consistent understanding of it's kind of jargony. Could you help us to understand what community wealth building is?
I mean, I think in our context, we look at the community bond as an instrument for community wealth building because we have existing assets from the community being invested into the community, creating, in this case, affordable housing that will benefit the livelihoods of those who enjoy the affordable housing. And so I think we see there, if not only financial wealth, their well-being improve. And any interest that we owe on a community bond goes back to our community members who have invested in us. So that interest stays in the community. So I think rather than investing in a vehicle that might be outside of our community, maybe even outside of our country, we have an exchange of resources that comes from and stays within the community. So it's an exchange, it's a productive exchange of capital, but every impact is right here at home.
Thank you very much. I think that idea is probably as close to radical as we could introduce at this table, in the sense that, we can imagine that community assets could be self-determined by members of the community, that they actually have the power and the interest to self-determine where they want to go with their assets. And the city as an enabler of that, instead of looking at the community as a beneficiary, or in this traditional charitable model of, we give and you receive, but trying to do something different with that so that we can actually reduce the number of frequent, the handout kind of hand up approach that we imagine things, and then we get frustrated that people's hands are still out. This is the way to do it. And so I'll look forward to asking staff questions on recommendation number 6 as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Chair Lieber.
Thanks very much, Mayor. Sorry, I'll struggle to be a little bit coherent on this one, but the long-range financial plan is obviously the corporation's plan for how we'll marshal our resources to be approved by this board. Steve Pomeroy is going to be asking us, and you've asked us to make space for an acquisition fund within our long-range financial plan. I think Steve is suggesting $5 million in the brief that he sent around. In order to integrate that into our long-range financial plan, we would need to have a funding source. to say, okay, if it's going to be $5 million, if it's going to be $10 million, if it's going to be $2 million, how is that going to fit into the plan that we set out for the corporation for marshaling our resources? And I'm wondering why we wouldn't just leave that as a year-to-year decision until we have a decision made that we are going to go into the acquisition business. There are two considerations on my mind. The first of which is you have done very, very well at marshaling a number of resources from outside city sources, including some political sources, and are well on the path to acquiring properties. Why, when the federal government is coming in with acquisition dollars, and you've been very successful with community fundraising, would the city then come in with municipal dollars as well?
It's a great question. And I think we are thrilled at the community's response through the community investment vehicle. And I think that we see that as a first step to helping to grow a revolving fund that we want to utilize and to tap other investment forms. I think at the end of the day, we will continue down that path. The momentum is there. And I think folks are realizing that there's potential in that. I think what we know is that when one purchases a building where the rents are maybe more than modestly affordable, but deeper affordable, reaching those, bottom quintile, even the bottom 2 quintiles, the rent revenue on that property is not going to get us a very large mortgage. And even a second mortgage through community investment will be limited because we need to service those debts, even if they're a low interest rate. We need to service those debts using the NOI on the property. When the rents are low, the mortgage is small, the second mortgage is also small. So we can then purchase properties that are at a bit of a higher price point where that level of affordability is modest. And I think we're willing to play that part within the system. Like I said, I think we need solutions right now across the housing system. But what I think we saw in our latest purchase in Vanier was a contribution of only 15,000 of non-repayable capital per unit allows us to hold all of those units over time at CMHC's average market rent. We wouldn't be able to do that without the 15,000 per unit. And well, in our first property, the rents are being protected at a much lower level than that. We couldn't be able to do that without some kind of non-repayable contribution. So I think the question then becomes, what would the instrument be used for? And if we want it to be used for deeper and deeper levels of affordability, I think that's the value. At 75,000 per unit, we can usually maintain a building at 80% of CMHC's AMR. Very few capital contributions for new construction can reach that level of affordability with a grant as small as 75,000. I'm not dissuading from spending on new development. We need that. But I think a small allocation towards acquisitions complementary could go a long way.
Why is $5 million the right number? Because I think we're going to hear that from Steve later on.
Honestly, I think it's seen as a reasonable amount. I think that in the back of the mind of those who sort of arrived at that, and I think it's a 2 to 5 million window, is a recognition that the city's half allocation is around 340 million, other contributions. And so as a proportionate slice of some of those larger funding envelopes, I think we thought that 2 to 5 was a modest way. We also do have to learn the acquisition process. And I hope that the report that comes will help us go beyond just funding questions, but where do we want to preserve? What housing should be preserved? What are the criteria for the units that we want to preserve? I mean, there's dozens and dozens of properties available today that we could try to buy, but where do we want to focus that attention? And so I think starting with I'll call it a more modest envelope of up to 5 million allows us to do this right, to plan our approach.
I think, I have not seen the response to, was it your motion on acquisition? Councillor Plant's motion on acquisition. I haven't seen that report, but I expect that we're going to hear the city wants to prioritize building. Building is something that we know well as opposed to acquisition. I think I know the answer to the question, but the purpose of putting acquisition dollars as a companion investment to construction is to take advantage of that economy of scale that you get in terms of the number of units that are affordable in the city.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think I mean, I think we need both tools, right? I think also, I mean, our first two purchases are 6 and 10 unit buildings in the heart of existing neighborhoods. I think there's a role to preserve that kind of neighborhood fabric in our neighborhoods across the city. So yeah, I see it as complementary.
And if we just left that to you, the civil society, how much slower would it be to acquire a meaningful portfolio?
I guess so. I mean, I don't mean to play semantics, but you know, in terms of what is a meaningful portfolio, we would not have been able to purchase our 10 unit building on Brant Street this summer. Our bond gave us the 15,000 was a commitment that our lender recognized and enabled us to close on that. So I think it would slow us down because I think we bring less capital to the table. But I think the biggest impact is that we would be acquiring properties that are less significant within our affordable housing crisis.
Yeah. I think a city investment could really kickstart that. You've done very, very well to raise the funds in the bond market that you have. You've done very, very well to raise political funds that you have. But I wonder how quickly you can get to some sort of meaningful scale in addressing the affordable housing crisis in Ottawa without that city investment. I just don't know that this council is going to go there today, and if we don't go there in the next couple of months, then there's no meaningful way we can include you in the long range financial plan. So that's something I'll struggle with over the course of the rest of this meeting today.
No, I appreciate that, and I know that wasn't a question, but I would just say, I mean, I think we have a commitment to continue on this path, and I think that even if we do end up with a portfolio at its outset where the units are a little bit less than as affordable that we want, we know that over time, nonprofit ownership will bring our units into a more affordable range. And I think that, you know, we can always refer to that proverb of, you know, we should have planted our tree 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. And I think that's the same logic of buying buildings that over time in our portfolio in under community ownership will become more affordable. So.
I hope we're going to hear from you again at budget time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Leeper. Councillor Trostner.
Hi, Mike. Nice to see you again. Yeah, I think it's really inspiring the work that you're doing. My own office wishes that we could contribute to a future acquisition, although we have future old Section 37 money that's supposed to come to us, but building permits have not been issued for many buildings that, you know, have promised that money. So it is very frustrating. I just, you know, there's some really innovative things contained in this report, and also that I know the city is doing. One of them is, and I'm sure Kel Brown will speak about this at some point, flexible cash subsidies so that folks can keep their housing and not fall into homelessness. And another really interesting thing is funding a pilot program through Operation Come Home to do block leasing to hold, you know, so that organization can hold a bunch of leases that they then sublet and do supportive housing. My question to you is, why do you think that acquisition is the model that we should really be putting our money, is, you know, either to complement these other initiatives or instead of? Because I think they're all trying to do the same thing, which is to combat housing loss and to prevent homelessness. But obviously the price tag is a lot higher on buying a building than it is on offering 1,300 cash subsidies, right? So what's the difference in your eyes? Why do you think this is the thing that we should be supporting?
Again, I will start by saying I think it's worthy of support alongside these other envelopes. I think that what we see in other municipalities is the articulation of pathways or roadmaps that are including buckets for multiple kinds of activity. I think that the case can be made in part by the price point of preserving a unit of affordable housing. I will say that, you know, we often hear, but when we put resources into an acquisition, we are not expanding our affordable housing stock. I think in response to that, we are preserving the housing of those who would otherwise be at risk if an owner, a financialized actor, purchased those buildings and raised those rents. So we are preventing homelessness. And I think we're preserving long-term affordability within the system, within the ecosystem of Ottawa. I'll also say just anecdotally that in the first building that we bought, we've had several turnovers, and in those unit turnovers, we're drawing residents from the city's waitlist for affordable housing. So we are already seeing that contribution to new units providing affordable housing. So I think, I mean, I think it comes down to the economics of acquisition. I think there are also arguments around preserving neighborhood fabric. I think preserving neighborhoods that allow spaces for existing residents to stay. I think that, you know, visions of neighborhoods where anybody can live, work, and play in a 15-minute neighborhood, or however that wants to be framed. I think acquisitions help us to do that as well. Yeah, alongside other tools, I think it's a really effective one at preventing displacement and helping expand that permanent affordability through community ownership. And I think we all know CHRA and other economists have shown that community-owned housing is the best way to preserve affordability for the long term.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Carr.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, for the delegation. I will say that when we talk about loss of naturally affordable housing, I think we can all admit that probably what we witnessed happen in Herongate was probably one of the worst losses that the city experienced, losing those units the way that we did. And certainly the city had a great role in terms of you know, developing an MOU so that we don't have losses like that in the future. I haven't read the Pomeroy report, which Councillor Leeper referenced, but my question is, you know, you answered Councillor Troster in terms of why acquisitions important and not just affordable housing. How many units do you see the city would be important for the city to acquire on an annual basis, for example? Like, is it 10 units? Is it 100 units? Like, how do you see the city's contributions in terms of contributing to that preservation of stock?
I think it does. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think it does come down again to what level of affordability we're trying to achieve through acquisition as a specific pathway. I think that the 5 million, if I'm not mistaken, in the report is premised perhaps on an allocation of about 75,000 per unit, which I think would allow the city to get to, I think in that case, between 50 and 75 units. I think that allocation could be a little bit less than 75,000 in some cases. I think the goal in that report, again, and I don't have it in front of me, but is to try to secure at least 100 units per year. I think that would be a modest contribution. You could look at that as maybe 5 or 6 smaller buildings, or, you know, 2 kind of 40, 50 unit type buildings. So I think that's where that starts. I'll add that, again, I mean, the BC government's Rental Protection Fund is one of the most significant acquisition funding programs in Canada. They're allocating up to $225,000 per unit. I know the real estate market in BC is a little bit different than here, but it just depends, I think, on what kind of range of affordability we want to preserve. As I said, in our Vanier purchase, $15,000 per unit is allowing us to keep rents at least 100% of AMR.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for mentioning the BC Protection Rental Fund and the difference in their economy, because I have wondered in terms of, you know, land trust in Vancouver is wildly successful, and I think in Toronto too, and I often wonder about the, you know, land value here in Ottawa, if it's the same, but I certainly understand the importance of acquisitions and supportive of it. Just last question, in the Pomeroy report, and I will get to reading it eventually, are those acquisitions specific to land trust, or are those all the acquisitions you do? Because certainly I'm on the OCH board. We had a major acquisition last year. Cornerstone, I think, has done acquisitions, multi-faith. That's everyone's acquisitions all included, is it?
Absolutely. So I'm, you know, Mr. Pomeroy is going to be speaking to you in a few minutes. I know he's registered. I think that report was commissioned by the Alliance to End Homelessness, and definitely the recommendations in that report are on behalf of the community housing sector in Ottawa, not specifically the OCLT. I mean, in a sense, I think it's fair to say that when the OCLT was created 4 years ago, the nonprofit and cooperative housing sector saw us as a dedicated vehicle to raising capital to try to pursue acquisitions in a way that most nonprofits and co-ops weren't really able to do. So, but you know, any request to the city would not simply be for the CLT.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, no, I appreciate it's a niche market that you've got there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Carr. Thank you very much for the presentation. We'll go next to Meg McCallum from the Alliance to End Homelessness.
There we go. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Meg McCallum. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa. The Alliance represents over 70 agencies and partners in the housing and homelessness sector in Ottawa, working together to end homelessness in our community. I'm also the co-chair of the new Housing and Homelessness Leadership Table, and I'm really looking forward to connecting with you all with that hat on as we get started on our work in the coming months. I want to start today by saying that the crisis of homelessness that we are experiencing is not inevitable, and it is solvable. Across the country and around the world, communities are reducing homelessness and even ending it altogether. The secret lies in targeting resources toward permanent solutions and committing to the change process required to go from managing the crisis through emergency responses to solving the crisis of homelessness. We know that affordable nonprofit housing, permanently and deeply affordable housing, is at the core of the solution, along with the supports to keep people stably housed. I'm here today to comment on the Housing Services Long-Range Financial Plan update, but I recognize that this report and the policies and funding strategies it contains are directly related to and connected to other strategies and things before you, including the 2025 budget to be tabled later this month, the upcoming reports on the Municipal Acquisition Strategy and Fund, and the Renovictions report that will be coming sometime later this fall. And also, of course, the upcoming update to the city's 10-year plan on housing and homelessness. And this, of course, all relates back to the city's term of council priority to create a city that has affordable housing and is more livable for all. I recognize the connection between the strategic priority and the financial plan, and I know that you all see and connect those dots as well. And the challenge that is before us is ensuring that the strategies and actions and the funding achieve the results that we need to do in the city. So I'd like to start by celebrating the elements that I see in the long-range financial plan as hopeful and helpful, and also adding in some comments and requests for improvement. So on the first point, providing stable, predictable funding is the key to encouraging steady growth. It sets a message that the city is a steady partner, and we greatly appreciate the intentionality around the commitment to ongoing funding. We appreciated the investment of $30 million in this year's budget through the top up from reserves, and we understand that the city is having to choose to prioritize other pressures this year. However, dropping back to the original baseline of stepping up by $1 million annually to $15 million by 2030 doesn't begin to meet the growing need in our city. We experienced the highest shelter use ever in 2023, and almost 1/4 of Ottawa's households face the choice between food and shelter. If funding doesn't keep up with this need, we fall further behind. And if I understood correctly from the presentation made by city staff, that the Housing Reserve Fund is in deficit now and needs to be replenished by upcoming year's capital contributions, then this is a backward slide. Second, again, a positive, focusing on permanent affordable housing and the supports that tenants need, even in the face of external factors beyond our control, shows a commitment to solutions that is very much appreciated. We appreciate the city's support in completing projects that faced significant construction cost challenges over the last few years. And we're excited about some of the affordable and supportive housing projects coming through the pipeline. However, we need to shift from funding transitional and emergency shelters because the bottleneck is the lack of permanent affordable housing, and we won't get past that bottleneck without that investment. Thirdly, the commitment from the city to strong ongoing advocacy to other orders of government is invaluable. Our member agencies and all of our sector associations advocate at every chance we can, but our voices are stronger when we work together, and we want to be your partners in this work. So we encourage Mayor Sutcliffe and all of City Council to take advantage of every opportunity to advocate for federal and provincial funding. Last week, we held the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference here in Ottawa with over 2,000 delegates from across the country to share lessons and strategize on achieving our shared goals. We took advantage of the presence of the federal housing minister at our opening plenary to push for federal support. And we greatly appreciate Councillor Ralston King's attendance and greetings and welcome on behalf of the city at the opening plenary, as well as the attendance of several members of council and key staff. This week, the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Associations has their conference in Ottawa, and you can bet your boots that we'll be there as well, advocating and look for your support at that table. Finally, with 4 seconds to go, sorry, the commitment to exploring the innovative new tools is most welcome. We are seeing the impact of the vacant unit tax, and I'm really keen to learn more about the initiative for debt financing. Again, there will be this report coming forward this fall regarding acquisitions, and I would encourage City Council to leave funding room to pilot this initiative while we wait for the federal acquisition funding to roll out.
Okay, I'm gonna
stop you there.
Yeah, if
thanks.
that's okay. Thank
Yep.
you. Councillor Menard?
Thanks very much, Mayor. Thanks, Meg, for being here. Great to see you, and thanks for your work as part of the acquisition strategy, the Ottawa Community Land Trust panel presentation that you gave. That was given, I think, just a month and a half ago, or so, a month ago. It's on that I wanted to ask you some questions. Obviously, we have a long-range financial plan in front of us now. There is some significant new funding, and in there, staff are talking about potentially doing some debt financing to make up for some of the shortfalls in what is needed and required. I'm wondering your views on that, and then secondarily, I wanted to get your opinion on the acquisition strategy. That there's not a bucket in there now, and we haven't had I think a formal full response back on the study of it. But what your views are on an acquisition strategy?
Thanks for the questions. I guess I'd just like to start by framing it and saying that, as Mike stated previously, like it all needs to be part of an overarching strategy with multiple tools addressing different parts of the system, both in terms of the type of built form, whether it's acquisitions or new builds, or direct subsidies to tenants in existing units. Those are all important. The other thing that's really important is the range of affordability. So different strategies are going to get to different levels of affordability. And speaking on behalf of the Alliance to End Homelessness, I can tell you that people with very low and low income are not able to meet the rents for units in acquisition projects. They're geared more at the sort of more moderate band. So we do need that comprehensive strategy. In terms of the acquisition strategy, I do think that's an important tool to have in our tool belt. We know that we lose 31 units of existing naturally occurring affordable housing units in the private market for every new one that we do manage to build. So, it all kind of goes back to the Alliance's starts with home platform: stop the loss, create more, and preserve the quality. We need the whole gamut.
Well, that's appreciated, and thank you for the advocacy here today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Troster.
Hi, Meg. Nice to see you today, and it was nice to see you at the conference last week. So I agree with you that the ideal is permanent affordable housing for everyone who needs it. One of the challenges that we have in Ottawa is we tend to be a feeder city for a lot of jurisdictions, because we have always said, you are welcome, we will not close our doors, which is something I would love us to continue to do, but it does present challenges, especially when it comes to the migration of asylum seekers into our city, which is where we're seeing the greatest growth. And so this is where I struggle, because there is a very large scale up here of transitional housing, which is not permanent, because we do have a very large mobile population of folks coming into our city. My stronger preference is permanent affordable housing. My question to you is, I know you're critical of that piece within the long-range financial plan. What would you like to see us doing differently that also accounts for this major fluctuation and this major influx that we're seeing? And frankly, with the results of the US election being called just this morning, we're going to see a lot more migration into cities like ours, especially asylum seekers. And so this presents a new challenge for sure. I'm not sure there's no way we could keep up building permanent affordable housing for all of them as much as I would like to. So what do you think would be the best case scenario given those difficult circumstances that we're under right now?
Yeah, I think the thing with housing development is that, back to Mike's tree analogy, that it takes time. It's a long range thing, right? So if we are investing in these transitional solutions, the decisions that you make today continue to have impacts years and years down the road, and so I definitely appreciate the challenge of being where we're at today and looking in the rearview mirror. I can see how we got here, both in terms of the lack of funding for affordable housing options, as well as the growing homelessness that resulted from that. So we're not in a good place to be able to respond to crises and emergency pressures on our system, like the pandemic that led to the creation of the PDCs, like the inflow of newcomers that has, really led to an explosion in growth of homelessness in our city. So all that to say, it's hard to start, but we do need to start. And my concern is that by starting with creating more transitional spaces, those rapidly turn into like really more or less kind of permanent spaces because there is nowhere for those people to go into permanent affordable housing. So that's why we're just going to keep repeating that we need to primarily invest in those permanent housing solutions so that we can, the transitional emergency response, that part should be the smallest part of the system. It's the upstream work on prevention and diversion, and it's the downstream work on permanent housing solutions that's really going to end homelessness.
Okay, thank you. Chair Leeper.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much, Meg, for being here. One of the most disheartening things I saw in the staff presentation was the cost per door and the increase in the cost per door to build that unit of affordable rental housing through especially supportive rental housing. Is that an inevitability? What did you see last week at the conference, for example, that indicates that we can build a lot more housing for the same dollars? Or is it inevitable that it's going to cost us as much to try to build the housing we need?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you for that. I guess what I would want to say is that, yeah, costs do go up over time. One thing that I know about the affordable housing sector is that we're not in the same place that we were 10 or 20 years ago. With operating agreements expiring, with the expiry of provincial mortgages, the maturity of the housing sector is quite different, and so their ability to access equity in their properties is a lot different than it was 10, 20 years ago. So and not only that, but again, across Canada, the number of really smart people who are thinking really great thoughts about innovative and unique financing models and coming up with very creative solutions, those are going to, they're levers that can be used to keep the housing supply increasing. I would like to hope that the rates of the construction costs won't continue to go up at the rates we've seen, but I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't feel comfortable prognosticating on that. But definitely, having that stable funding allows us to access the equity, financing, and loans that are needed to build housing. I guess one thing I just want to add too is that, when the staff was doing their presentation, they showed the nice charts showing the different contributions from different levels of government in the new construction and capital funding. And what's missing from those slides is the huge amounts of funding that are going in from the community housing sector. So you can bet that for every dollar that goes in from government funding, there's dollars that are going into a mortgage that's held by the housing provider.
The leader of the opposition has recently suggested that he would pursue a different course on affordable housing. Partially would be removing the sales tax on the sale of homes that are under $1 million. And in order to pay for it, would axe the half. Can I just ask you what the consequences of that would be for building housing for people who need it, since I've got you here? And I apologize for putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, for sure. I think the whole thing with housing is that, unlike the CPP or the OAS, it's not a universal benefit. It's, affordable housing subsidies or capital dollars don't meet the need. We know that, right? So if he's planning, if the thought is to remove a program that's targeted toward affordability for the people who need affordability and apply that instead across the board to anything being built under $1 million, it really dilutes the impact for the people who really need access to that very scarce resource.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much, Meg.
Thanks,
Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Meg, as always, for presentation. My question is about supportive housing. I think we get tied up, the idea that if we build X number of units, everything is going to be great. But the reason a lot of people are homeless is they're just incapable of living on their own. They've lost their way, and they need support. They need supportive housing. And the concern there is, where does it come from? Because it's not just about units, it's about the operational dollars. And OCH is looking at this, of course, with our complex care idea of reserving units for such needs. But it's the operational dollars, and I just want to get your comments on the importance of supportive housing.
Yeah, for sure. I think we all recognize that supportive housing is a critical element of the affordable housing universe, and that without supportive housing, there are people who would not be able to maintain their housing independently just through the affordability. So it is a critical piece. And it's something that our sector is advocating very strongly to the provincial government to make sure that when capital dollars are available to build, that the operating dollars and the for mental health and health supports are there right alongside. Again, it's that stable and predictable funding so that we can do what we do best and get it built and operate it successfully.
Thank you. Yes, it's got to be continuous. We can't just have one-time funding for these kinds of things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for your time.
Next, we're going to go to Steve Pomeroy, please.
Thank you, Mayor, for the opportunity to speak today. Sorry for the echo chamber. I'm in a cloakroom at Statistics Canada. I'm going to build on the information that Michael and Meg have already shared, and I have spoken to the committee a number of times in the past, and I think you're quite familiar with the research work I've done over the years, particularly documenting this extensive loss of the existing private rental affordable stock, and which is the basis for which we need to basically plug the holes in the bucket. And increase opportunities to purchase that stock. Not to say that we should purchase every single building that becomes available, but to strategically purchase sound older buildings that are housing folks at moderate incomes. I think if we look historically at the city of Ottawa, one of the most successful nonprofit housing corporations in this country is CCOC here in Ottawa, and about half their portfolio was created as a result of acquisitions in the old program days. So this is not a new idea. It's been very successful in the past, and it can be very successful in the future. Certainly we need to build, but we're never going to build ourselves out of this problem, so we need complementary strategies that work alongside, and I think that's what the acquisition piece is trying to do. The cost numbers that the staff put up in terms of the new costs of building affordable housing, the problem is that the income levels and the capacity to pay rents of the people we're trying to serve have been very, very constrained and are very limited. Most are not indexed. We haven't seen any indexation of welfare rates and those types of things. And so that's why the subsidy gap is getting bigger. Costs are being driven up in the marketplace. Our revenue potential is not there. And therefore, we're seeing much, much higher subsidy requirements for new. And I think compared to building new, purchasing existing properties is very, very cost effective. I mean, indeed, the asset values have been going up there as well, but not to the same degree that they have in the case of new build. So I think there are a number of compelling cases why we should be doing the acquisition piece. I think the reason I wanted to delegate today was that back in the spring, Planning and Housing Committee delegated a responsibility to staff to bring forward a report on the options and opportunities to have an acquisition strategy, including funding. That was to be reported back in the second quarter. That report has been delayed, and here we are with a cart and horse problem, where we're now approving a capital plan prior to that report being presented. And so my purpose really is to simply ask for a carve out, or at least a placeholder to be put in the capital plan to ensure that if that report comes forward, the recommendations for capital, that we actually are able to fund it. As Mike's indicated, the proposed budget of up to $5 million is a very small portion of the total amount of funding that's available to the city through various sources. It fits within some of the accelerator fund, the Housing Accelerator Fund. The federal government's one of the permitted uses is acquisition, and OPPI also allows acquisition as part of that budget as well. So we have budget envelopes that are allowed to do this if we actually choose. If you choose to allocate the money that way. I think it's the intent there is the 2 to 5. Back to one of the questions that Councillor Lipa asked, was based on a more detailed report that I prepared for the Alliance to End Homelessness. The intent of that report was to try to quantify and develop some sound policy recommendations to assist staff as they develop their own report. And in doing so, we looked at the relative levels of the cost of acquisition, the kind of prices that exist, or the rents that exist in the kind of buildings which we would be targeting. And based on that analysis, we would be looking roughly for $25,000 to $75,000 per unit for an acquisition, an average of $50,000 a unit. 50,000 at 100 units is essentially your 5 million at the top end, lower at the bottom end. That can certainly be augmented with additional policies around, for example, taking some of the rent supplement allocation and ensuring that the rents are brought up to an effective rental income of 100% of AMR, even though the tenant themselves would be subsidized at a lower rent. That also improves the leverage and reduces the amount of grants. So it's not just capital grants, it's how we do that with other mechanisms as well. So I simply would like to reiterate the points that Mike made, to ask committee if you would at least consider identifying an opportunity to preserve some up to $5 million in the capital plan in the event that staff recommend a funding mechanism to support acquisitions over the next couple of years as a complement to the overall strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Mayor. And I think the case has been made repeatedly that an acquisition fund is necessary and needed, given that we're losing 31 affordable units for every new affordable unit built. But I guess the question really is, so just to Steve Pomeroy, is the federal government coming up with an acquisition strategy as well? Is this something that they're doing?
Yes, as we saw, the federal budget made an announcement to allocate $1 billion in loan authority, which gives us access to cheap financing, which means for every unit we can borrow more against the net income, and that helps to reduce the capital requirements. They have also identified up to $477 million for grants. The flow in the budget was $5 million this year, $100 million next year, and so. And I've been involved in consulting with the Housing and Infrastructure and Communities Canada, who have been charged with developing this policy, and they're basically saying that they really won't have anything in place. They won't be rolling that out until probably 2026. So it's definitely, I think it's pretty sure it's coming. But in the next year and a half, I mean, I've been advocating for an acquisition approach in this country for the last 20 years. 20 years ago, when I started talking about it, you could buy them $75,000 a unit. So back to Mike's definition of 20 years ago is the time to be doing this. We didn't. Do you want to wait another year and a half, or can the city help us to accelerate the pace of acquisitions over the next couple of years? And at that point, we would then fold into the federal funding and basically morph into utilizing their money. It wouldn't require them funding from the city anymore. And in terms of borrowing against the property, one of the challenges is you can't borrow 100% of the cost. No lender will give you 100% of the cost, not even the federal government. So you do need some equity. And while the Land Trust has been able to secure some equity in the form of the community bonds, other providers may not have that same equity. So to make sure that others have opportunities to do acquisitions as well, it would support the broader ecosystem in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just, having the municipality, I guess, to have a framework and a contributing factor to our city in addition to other funds likely makes a lot of sense. I'll certainly ask staff about our approach to acquisitions in the question period to them. I think you've made the case very well for us taking our own action here in the city in partnership with other orders of government. I guess we haven't had a report back yet. I hear that that's coming in November or December, which is great news. And I guess the impetus that Mr. Pomeroy is making is that this shouldn't be excluded from our long-range financial plan because we may want to do this in the future. And I guess, Steve, I'll ask that question certainly to our staff. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. That concludes the delegations. I'll open it up to members of the committee and councillors to ask questions or make comments about the report. Vice Chair Gower.
Thanks, Mayor. With apologies to Chair Leeper, who asked sort of this question to the delegates. We have had federal leaders openly state they would like to end the Housing Accelerator Fund. What funding in this plan could be at risk? Can staff be clear on that?
What we have included is a plan, and for example, the Housing Accelerator Fund, we have an agreement in place, so they would have to back out of that agreement. So what we've included in the plan is what we already know of or can predict. It could change, absolutely, but we've put in what we can predict. We would have to revisit if those plans change.
But does that mean then 2025 and beyond, anything that's currently in our plan from the federal government Housing Accelerator Fund, it could be at risk if any federal party decides to prematurely end that agreement?
I assume so. I don't know what the bandwidth they would have to do that. We have an agreement. They would have to be backing out of it.
Are there penalties if they were to do that, or there must be some kind of a risk from the federal level if they exit an agreement that they've signed with a municipality?
Mr. Mayor, the federal government in their agreements will include a clause that says that the agreement is valid provided there's funds available in the budget. So there is always the flexibility for the federal government to withdraw those funds.
Okay. Then in the near term, like over the next 3 years, do we have a contingency plan in order to make up those dollars? Because I know there's affordable housing nonprofit providers making plans right now to put shovels in the ground and build. In the very short term, seems to me that money could very well be at risk. What would we do?
So the only commitments we make is annually as part of the budget process, and those commitments are at that point in time.
Okay.
It's done on an annual basis, part of the budget process, and any future years would only be committed once council approves it as part of that budget.
So then we could either decide to make up that budget through other sources, make up that money through other sources, or that money just wouldn't be available and we would certainly not meet anywhere near our housing target for those years.
We would have to reduce the number of units that we can achieve.
Okay, that's pretty dire, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, I'm interested in the debt financing. We're being asked to direct staff to do a feasibility study. What's the time frame for that, and what's involved in that feasibility?
So we have been exploring for actually over the past year, looking at different models and how it could work. The model already assumes about 75% debt to equity financing. So it's adding additional financing on top of that. So it impacts affordability overall, but it would advance funding or advance the building construction of affordable units. So that's what we're balancing, is trying to figure out how could that actually work. We are working with OCH. They are already reported on our financial statements. Their debt is already part of our debt on our financial statements. So we're exploring it technically internally and not looking more broadly to see how it could actually work, just looking at the model itself.
And timelines to get back on recommendations?
It's hard to predict, but we're hoping next year for sure, as part of the, at a minimum, as part of the next year's budget process.
Okay. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Vice Chair Gower. Councillor Menard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for the report. A lot of good things in here, certainly, and appreciate the work. The piece we heard from the delegations was on, well, a lot, but on acquisition fund was a main point they were making repeatedly. Does staff see the benefit of acquiring already existing properties rather than building new, and the potential cost benefit to the municipality?
Mr. Mayor, I've had the opportunity to work quite a bit in the area of acquisition funds. My professional opinion would be that an acquisition fund could be part of a holistic approach to ensure Ottawa has affordable housing, and that housing aligned with the need. Acquisition funds, as the delegates would have mentioned, really about preserving affordability. And you do that by financially supporting the community housing sector to purchase these naturally affordable housing units from the private sector. So typically it's going to be real estate investments trusts, private investors, so your mom and pop kind of investors. And those buildings are going up for sale for various reasons. So while it doesn't support new supply, it can help with the availability of affordable supply. One thing I would say, and this is just on council's direction, as staff has been exploring it, there are a number of considerations when you're thinking about acquisition. The reason that the properties offer lower rents is because they tend to be older structures, often near or at end of life or underinvested in, depending on who the owner has been. And they often require significant capital repairs or capital investment. And so beyond the cost of purchasing the asset is the cost of repairing, modernizing, investing in the property so that it remains habitable and meets standards. So it's a significant consideration. The delegation would have also spoke to the federal government's commitment in budget 2024 around an acquisition fund. We're hearing that we might hear something soonish. And I think that's going to be very critical if council does want to think about an acquisition fund. How a federal fund is designed and delivered is important. It's important to avoid duplication of effort. We have limited resources at the city, and I think that's a very important consideration. But it's also important, if it is the will of council to go forward with an acquisition fund, to think about complementarity. So depending on how the federal fund is designed, would a municipal fund complement that, for example, by helping to build capital reserves? So those are important things to consider, and will be useful to see that federal fund come out. And then finally, I would just comment that there is a significant supply gap in the city of Ottawa. We see that in vacancy rates, we see that in rent rates. Both the federal government and the provincial government are prioritizing supply of housing for those very reasons. And both governments have put future funding contingent on the city's ability to meet aggressive targets as it comes to new supply. Staff currently have been focusing all their efforts, and it's considerable effort, in terms of allocating the funds, working with the residential housing sector, the community sector, to move projects along the process and get them to building permit stage. And that work is happening now, but it will need to continue in an aggressive way in the future as well. And then finally, there is an IPD at the November 20th Planning and Housing Committee, and it provides a more fulsome kind of analysis of the situation.
That's very helpful, and really happy to have Ms. Stewart's expertise and all the work with previously your past work experience as well is really welcome by the municipality. So I'm happy that you're here, and I think the work on what you mentioned on the capital repair piece, that's always been an issue. Even with the social housing mortgages federally, it was you can fund those mortgages over time, but then capital repair funds need to happen with those as well. And appreciate you saying that there could be a potential joint strategy where feds and the municipality are each contributing to needed potential buckets there of for maintaining that existing housing. And then of course all supply is not created equal. I think the like urban boundary expansion supply, very expensive supply for us, doesn't create affordable housing, as our staff have said in the past in reports. And things like acquisitions, though they may not add to new supply, keeping that old supply, which could be converted to much more expensive housing in the future, for example, is very important. So I appreciate that. Just on the question of the long-range financial plan is in front of us now. The report's not going to come back until after we've considered this. So does it preclude us from investing in a type of acquisition strategy or setting that up in the near future, even though the LRFP is not putting a bucket or placeholder in there right now?
So the city currently has the ability to fund acquisitions. Those authorities exist in Action Ottawa. In fact, the city has a number of pilots, or a couple of pilots that are underway to really test the acquisition and to draw lessons learned from that process. So for example, are we seeing that there is a need to invest more in the physical state of the asset? Are the tenants able to support rents that keep the lights on and maintain the operations? Will the tenants have the ability to pay higher rents that will support capital repairs? So those pilots are providing a lot of useful information for staff, but the key message is that the city currently has the ability to undertake acquisitions through existing programs, and it does do that.
Just don't want to go down a path where we're excluding anything coming on the acquisition side in particular in the future, and it sounds like we're getting confirmation we're not. So that's very helpful, and I look forward to the discussion at, I guess, Planning and Housing Committee in terms of how we go forward on that one piece of priority. A lot of the rest of this is excellent. I do want to just reiterate Meg McCallum's point around we had found funds to get up to 30 million annually on that capital side. And I know there's other funds federally and provincially and that we're utilizing now in terms of the investment in housing in the city, which is amazing. But the need is growing even faster than we can keep up with. And I wonder what staff's response is on the 15 million with a incremental increase on, kind of inflationary increase versus that higher figure of 30 million, which we found last budget. Though it was indicated as a one-time investment, the need obviously is not declining.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'll go first, and Isabel wants to top me up, she can, as always. But as a reminder, when we did that 30 million back November around, this time of year last year, I stated there was a risk that, it was a one-time thing because we were coming back with the updated long-range financial plan, and there was a risk to that funding strategy. So from a reserve perspective, we are in a committed deficit. So what this strategy is, and what Isabel's put forward for you, is it's a little bit different strategy in terms of we're identifying the more secure, predictable funding, which is about $20 million on average over the next 6 years. If you layer in a VUT report that was just approved by committee, goes to council, and if that report gets approved, that's additional 4 million. So then we're up to that 24.5 million. And then when you layer in the other components of the fundings that we're forecasting to come in, our actual annual contribution is up in that $27 million range over the next 6 years. So again, a little bit of up and down a little bit, but at least it's a more stable, predictable base of that 18.9 growing to 22.4, layer in the other elements in the VUT. It's a what I would call a more solid, refined strategy for good, stable, predictable funding.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And I know that we will have the acquisition conversation at a later time, so I'll look forward to that then. I think I am very interested in recommendation 6. As I mentioned before, I understand it's only within the scope of OCH at this time because it's a known entity to us. But I have to say, just to be even discussing, a different kind of risk threshold when it comes to advancing housing more quickly and using financial tools at our disposal in a creative way, I don't think we were there 5 years ago. And so I just really want to commend everyone for starting to think creatively, because I think we can agree that there's going to be some serious pressure on new construction. And we are tied. You are right. Like, the funding comes from building the new thing. But this report already demonstrates, the different financial pressures on those new things since 2021. The cost per door of being close to 50 to 60% greater than it was in 2021. Oh my goodness. We are falling farther behind. And I'm glad I wasn't the first person to mention the presidential election today. But, I think we're going to have to think about that. The tariffs on new construction materials in 2018 were significant. We import lumber, we import steel and iron, we import aluminum. These are the things we need to build new construction. Hydro Ottawa, their supply chain hasn't come back since COVID. And we all know their ambitious plans under huge pressure. So I think it would be really out of touch to not consider what other models can come to pass. So I wonder whether maybe, our new GM of strategic initiatives, who has already spoken so well, and I'm pleased that you're here, might consider, expanding on number 6, or helping us to understand, if this proves positive with OCH, would we consider moving to, new financial models with other nonprofit providers, or other programs, let's say, where we could have applicants, for example, that could be screened on certain criteria that could help us use our credit rating and our reputational capital in this way.
Mr. Mayor, may I offer a couple comments on that? Okay. So when I came here, what I want to say is that I was very impressed. I was impressed with what council had already approved and put in place. I think there are a number of really fantastic tools at the municipal level that, if they're applied effectively, they can really drive more investment into housing. And that investment can come from the private sector, it can come from the community housing sector, other levels of government, the philanthropic sector as well. And so I think that is something that is really worth noting. I would also call out the team to my right here. I think that I would be remiss if I didn't say they've done a really fantastic job capitalizing on the funds from senior levels of government and working very diligently to build a pipeline of projects. Pipeline of projects helps open the door. We're able to have conversations with other levels of government and other investors to say, these are the types of opportunities that could happen in Ottawa with additional investment. And so I think that that's worth calling out. There were a couple other things I'll just comment on quickly. Council had directed use of surplus municipal lands to support affordable housing. I think there's a lot that can be done there. Lands could be a phenomenal tool to attract investment. There are creative ways that lands can be put to use. And I was quite pleased to learn about Build Ottawa and what Build Ottawa could offer in terms of surplus lands and looking at how to develop those sites that are going to ensure that there's a mixity of housing, both in terms of income, but also, I guess, mixed use in terms of other services on site. And then finally, happy to say the Strategic Initiatives Department is really starting to get into its planning process. And one of the things that we absolutely want to explore is innovative financing opportunities. There are ways, I think, to help municipal investments go further. It'll require some work and due diligence to make sure that we're doing that effectively, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's also opportunity to explore more efficient and cost-effective building techniques that are emerging more strongly within the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So one of the one of the comments that that I had heard when it came to the community bond that the Land Trust had fundraised for was, that larger financial institutions would be unlikely to invest in a community bond like that because it is so new, because their risk tolerance or their risk profiles for their, mutual funds or whatever else they might use, would not permit that kind of investment. could the city of Ottawa guarantee a certain percent of that loan to allow for larger institutions to invest in things like that, for example, like just, different ideas like that. I've also heard, that the Ottawa Community Foundation, I've spoken with them on a number of occasions, are also very interested in advancing housing, of course, and they have endowment funds, specifically for that. How could we think differently about trying to support philanthropic contributions towards housing directly? The City of London has a very interesting, I don't know what you would call it, but it's like it's their whole plan also includes the London Community Foundation, and we've met with them to sort of chat about that. So I'm very encouraged by this report. I'll wait for the acquisition conversation when it comes to capital dollars for when it's appropriate. But number 6, I think, is the it's the door opening for the ideas that we haven't had yet. And I think that is an important part of planning. You can call it a research and development, thumbprint for people to come and tell us different ways that we can leverage financing to support them so that the City of Ottawa doesn't have to be the landlord. We don't have to be the ones who are, constantly worried about capital investments down the road or those types of things. There are community partners that are willing to do that and that have the frameworks to do that, but do require equity and land, absolutely, to be able to advance on that with the speed required to address this crisis. So yeah, those competing prices are going to be coming for all of our builders who currently are sitting on their builds waiting for that economic moment to make it viable. I'm anxious now that that is going to be farther away, and so the creativity to come will be imperative for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Trostler.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to thank staff for this report. I too am really excited by some of the innovative ideas here. And frankly, the ambition of this council and of city staff to really try to solve the housing and homelessness crisis. Last week, I was incredibly fortunate to spend it with 2,000 housing advocates from across the country and with city staff. It actually underlined how we're doing a lot better here than a lot of jurisdictions are doing, even though it feels like the problem is endless. I have a few questions and then a few comments. My first question is, in terms of indirect contributions, the report notes that the city is projected to provide $66.4 million in the next 6 years for indirect relief. Do you have a sense of what the split is between indirect support to nonprofit providers versus private developers?
So the tax increment equivalent grant is the only one that's being provided to private developers. So that line item is the only one.
So that's the CIP, the Affordable Housing.
The CIP,
Okay.
exactly.
And I understand uptick has been great on that. So one of the groups that are the hardest to house are couples, specifically male-female couples. My understanding, my office deals with a lot of encampments, and this is the typical profile of someone who cannot or will not go to shelter. It's usually a male-female couple living together in a tent, sometimes with a pet. Is there any plan within this long-range financial plan for housing to be able to figure out how to accommodate these folks who are the most likely to refuse an offer of shelter? Or even of housing if they're not allowed to stay together?
Thank you for the question, Mayor. What we're working on is there's some new opportunities coming forward through both the federal government around encampment funding. So we're working with them very closely on that. And one of the key opportunities we have when we look at what are the root causes of why people are in encampments, of course, as you mentioned, pets and couples. Another very exciting opportunity as we expand that transitional housing space is we'll have more opportunities within the system to potentially rejig and work with our partners to be able to meet those missing needs of people in encampments. So again, one of the key things for those new funding opportunities is I think that's top of mind for us to look at programming that will address couples and pets, but there'll also be longer term opportunities as we get more shelter beds to be able to leverage the existing system beds that you see in this plan for different uses like accommodating that.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, another factor is either a complex addiction or trauma accumulated from, spending time in the shelter system and having bad experiences. So we deal with that a lot with residents who are homeless in my ward. Kale, I was lucky enough to hear the presentation you gave at the conference to end homelessness last week, specifically about our portable housing subsidies and how they've been really effective in preventing people from falling into homelessness. My understanding is that last year we funded them out of city money. Now I'm looking and seeing in table 7 that there's a projected funding need of $288 million and no current planned funding. So does that mean we will not be offering those subsidies in 2025?
So the presentation, Chair, is what was actually given was related to a bridge funding benefit that's municipally funded through that city homelessness funding. That benefit's actually a very short-term benefit to try and stabilize people. We do leverage on the other end of that should they not be able to stabilize, i.e. find a job, get the appropriate mental health supports, addiction supports to stabilize their own housing. We can also transition them primarily to a provincial benefit, which is the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. So that is fully provincially and federally funded. So we continue to have that available within the National Housing Strategy for the next 2 years. So again, we're more funding the transitional benefits, which are not meant to be or intended to be long-term.
Okay, so we do have money for that for the next 2 years?
That is correct. We built that into the budget and through council in our most recent homelessness prevention programming report, we had actually upped that amount by almost $300,000. So we continue to make investments and make that available to anyone who is an appropriate fit for that type of programming.
Okay. Yeah, I encourage other councillors to check in with their housing department to learn more about the effectiveness of this program. When I was at the conference and seeing you present, people from other cities were madly scribbling this down. Such a simple concept. Give people money to help them get through a hard time so they don't fall into homelessness. Just drilling down a little bit more in the supportive housing piece. The report briefly touches on the barriers to meeting our goals for supportive units. Do we have any anticipated additional funding streams from higher levels of government that could help us meet that 50 unit target per year? Because I must tell you, it's folks who have the highest need who sadly end up causing the highest level of disorder when they are unwell in our community, specifically downtown. And so a scale up of supportive housing is really, really crucial in my community. And I'm just wondering, do you think we'll realistically be able to meet this goal of 50 new supportive housing homes a year?
Mr. Mayor, currently we are not aware of additional sources of funding from other levels of government. We're hopeful that a rapid housing initiative round 4 would be launched. There has been some talk about that, but we have not heard anything further on that.
Yeah, and it goes without saying, if the rapid housing initiative is canceled, if the housing accelerator fund is canceled, if there are anyone's from opposition parties at the federal level listening, like, we will be destitute in terms of our ability to fund supportive housing. I mean, again, supportive housing, cheaper than shelter, cheaper than incarceration in emergency rooms, but getting that operational funding is so difficult. And I know I'm like a broken record around this table, but to have to go cap in hand to other levels of government to solve these massive problems that are rooted in poor federal and provincial decision-making is really, really frustrating. And I hope if my residents are listening that they understand this, because what we often hear is, what are you doing? How are you fixing it? How do you make it go away tomorrow? And to them, I say, even 50 supportive housing units per year, which is a drop in the bucket when we think we have about 700 to 1,000 chronically homeless people in our city. So that would, assuming there's no new folks added to that list, that would still take us 10 years or more. We don't have a funding source. We have a giant hole in our budget. So, I like the optimistic projections in this long-range financial housing plan. I hope other levels of government meet us there, but I'm feeling worried, specifically about a potential change in federal government. And then I think at that point, we're going to have to regroup as a council and say, okay, do we solve this problem ourselves because we have no choice? Because the alternative is more expensive and more human suffering, right? And more social disorder and just general upset among residents. So anyway, thank you very much. I just want to, again, thank you for all the work that goes into this, and specifically to the Housing Services Department for all the work that you've done with my office when we're advocating for folks who have some pretty tough cases. The ideal is to build as much affordable housing as quickly as possible, but in the meantime, just the flexibility of a cash transfer to be able to help somebody through a hard time.
It's time, Councillor.
Makes a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yeah, thank you to the whole housing team for all your work. Particularly the close relationship with Ottawa Community Housing. Ottawa Community Housing, the city of Ottawa is the sole shareholder of Ottawa Community Housing. So we have an invested interest to work together, and we're doing some major projects. And I say we because I'm the chair, so I wear two hats. One of the things that they were able to pull off last year was acquisitions. And I just want to point out, Steve Pomeroy was talking about you need 50,000 per unit to acquire some housing. OCH had a Minto acquisition where they spent $7 million for 311 townhouse units. So it was pretty incredible. The amount of funds that was given for that from the city, nil. This was something that they took advantage of. This is why Ottawa Community Housing, and again, we're the sole shareholder, is really important. They see opportunities and they take them. I just want your comment on that, because my concern is that we want to make sure that we have that half funding in place for new acquisitions. And we have so little of it, and we have to move forward. So I'm just making sure that we have balance. So can I get some comments on that, please?
Mr. Mayor, to the point on acquisitions, as I stated earlier, staff has been doing work on that, and we do think it's part of a holistic approach to affordable housing. There's important considerations and key decisions that need to be made, because there's significant funding that is at risk from other levels of government if we're not achieving aggressive targets as it comes to building permits and new affordable housing units as well. And that's not to say that there aren't some great opportunities that come along. And as I mentioned earlier, city staff currently have the ability to support acquisitions through existing programs and to allocate those funds. So take advantage of those opportunities as they arise, and continue the piloting as we wait further information from the federal government, and bring forward further information for council's consideration around an acquisition fund.
Thank you. I think that given that we're not going to have that 30 million again, we're working with some pretty tight numbers, and we have to make the best use of that money. We need large scale projects, and this is extremely important that we're ready for it. We have to have shovel ready projects, and housing solutions are not just one way, but we need to be able to provide housing on a large scale. OCH has been delivering on that, and I think we have to keep that in mind. And I appreciate the fact that we're talking about OCH a lot in this report. I also want to say thank you for the fact that we're talking about the capital repair funding, which is making sure that we keep the housing we have. That is very crucial when we're talking about the fact that affordable housing hasn't been built on a large scale since over 50 years. So we're keeping old stock in good shape and more environmentally friendly. So I appreciate that, but I just want to reiterate that we have to look at how we're using the funds on a large scale as well, because we need those units, and we've got projects that are ready. And just caution you, and OCH will continue to look for opportunities for acquisition. We were lucky enough not to even need the city's help in that major purchase, which is keeping 311 units affordable. But not sure how it will work in the future, but I hope that we'll continue to look at that scale. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Leeper. Sorry, Chair Leeper.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Mayor. Just a few comments, I believe, I'm the last speaker on this one. The I just wanted to let committee members know on the Planning and Housing Committee that we are expecting that response to the plant motion on November the 20th with respect to the acquisition of housing and the feasibility of that. My intention, we're also going to be debating the budget. So rather than and I'm speaking to some of the delegates probably directly at this point, but rather than a separate debate, which would require councillors to lift a memo to be a debate, I'm going to ask everyone to just wrap that up in the larger budget discussion. I anticipate that you'd be coming forward with requests, and I'm sure councillors will as well, to allocate capital dollars in this budget to the acquisition of housing. I don't know whether or not that is something the committee will ultimately support, since either that money is going to have to come out of doing something else, probably constructing doors, or increasing the tax rate. But that was how I intended to handle it. So you'll see an agenda that comes out with acquisition as a separate item on our agenda, but I will be bundling it all up as a single budget debate. With respect to the half funding, that's to answer Councillor Gower's question. That's 4 equal payments of $44 million. That would be at risk. Now, I presume that we already have the 2024 check in the bank, but we still have 3 more tranches of $44 million each that we have not received a check for. Would that be correct? 2025, 2026, 2027.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yep. And the federal government does have the flexibility to not fund those tranches should it choose, which is a real risk in the case of an election. The best answer staff has been able to give me is that we would pivot. There would probably be projects that don't move ahead. That's a $44 million check each year is not going to be something we can fill out of our own pockets, probably. So it is important to talk to the federal government should it change, about the importance of maintaining that funding, because as we heard Ms. McCallum said, it is directly targeted at helping the residents in our city who need that help the most. The other thing that I just wanted to make mention of is I would hate to see half funding be put toward acquisition. We need to construct doors with that half funding in order to try to meet the targets that we have. And then finally, with respect to the base funding discussion that's come up a couple of times, I just want to say I will be supporting the approach that staff have suggested. When I first got elected, we had a $5 million municipal contribution of capital toward creating housing. That went to 0 as a result of the download of some pressures to, I believe, OCH. Then it went back up to 5. Then we got it up to, I believe, 10, up to 15, up to 30, and that's all reserves and it's not sustainable. We can't yo-yo staff like that. Staff need to have some predictability in how much money is going to be in the capital. We've heard over and over again for the past couple of years the importance of that pipeline. Staff have been doing amazing work for several years now, managing that pipeline, making sure there's always projects in the queue that are getting ready to go, helping the very early stage pipeline projects get something real together, helping the next phase find their financing. Having predictable funding is critical to managing that pipeline. And so even though I think the advocates will see a retrenchment to a lower baseline, at least I'm confident that that baseline will be there year after year, increase year after year. And so I'll be supporting that, that initiative. Mayor, I think those were the only comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair Leeper. All right then, on the item, is that carried?
I have a dissent, Mr. Mayor, on 2 and 6.
I'm dissenting on 8.
Okay. We've got that. All right, thank you. Motion to adjourn? Carried? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup.